federal state of Cyprus ensure through the application of the principles of the unified economy. The timely elimination of the economic gap between the two communities is of the utmost importance for the survival of the federal state in Cyprus, since this forms one of the major potential sources of conflict. The transfer of resources from the Greek to the Turkish Cypriot community through the establishment of a special fund and the provision of fiscal incentives for the economic development of the Turkish Cypriot community will be steps in the right direction. I believe that a strong central government with responsibility for the management of the Special Reconstruction and Development Fund and all functions necessary to maintain a unified economy is an essential prerequisite for ensuring rational economic development in a federal state of Cyprus and thereby safeguarding the existence of such a state. The best example of a successful federal arrangement with a strong central government is provided by the Federal Republic of Germany, whose economic achievements are very well known. Germany has benefited from a strong central government which has complete control over the utilization of funds. Recently, following the reunification of Germany, a special fund was set up under the control of the central government for the transfer of resources to what was previously known as the German Democratic Republic, with the objective of eliminating the economic gap separating East and West Germany. If this is the case with Germany, which is a relatively large country with vast resources, then it is absolutely necessary for a very small country like Cyprus if the objectives for economic development and social justice in a federal state are to be attained. Thank you very much.
Trying to find a better room for you because I know that you're competing for oxygen. Obviously, your presence here is a testimony to your interest in the problems we're discussing. If we finish, don't there were any questions?
Okay, so are there any questions from the floor?
I have a question for both of you. You spoke about federation and some solution, economic solutions to federation. But the problem that is expressed in the North is that the problem of representation.
Representation in the sense of
in the federal government, yeah.
Right, yes. Well, I mean, obviously we're talking about the economic dimension of the issue. I mean, we're not talking about political issues, but obviously they do impinge on each other. And the question would be really what the I mean, one issue would be what the economic functions of the central government would be, and therefore what representation would there be by the Turkish Affairs in that government. That's one issue. Obviously, the federal government can have state government, perhaps lower level government, making certain economic responsibilities. So I guess the representation, the more if you like, the more economic responsibility the central government has, the greater representation by the minority community would have to be. And that would be, so there would be a sort of, political and economic relationship there. And what the form that would take would be very much up to Cypriots to decide, basically, in the context of talks.
I have a suspicion, I don't know, it's only a suspicion, that technocrats are very often more capable perhaps of solving the problems economically and fiscal problems than politicians, without claiming to be a technocrat myself. So I think if we are allowed, or if the technocrats are given the opportunity to meet be challenged, I'm confident that they will find suitable answers to lots of the problems.
Well, you were supposed to keep
well, speaking of the economic layman, I know very little about economics. Dr. Christopher said that Mr. Sorry, you said that it is more urgent because Cyprus is a small country than it is in the case of Germany. But is there a corresponding plus, namely that because it's small, once it gets going, it'll be quicker, it will be achieved just more quickly? Is that possible?
Well, the answer I would say yes. In a way, the small size of the market is an advantage in that you can plan and you can follow up the plans. And this is probably proved also by the aid given during the last 20 or 30 years by the United Nations and its specialized agencies. And I'm informed that these agencies are very pleased with the work which has been done in Cyprus, probably because of the size of the market. They can follow the plans, they can be there and then all the time. So there is certainly a plus in that respect.
Sorry, I'm very sorry, we must move on. Would you mind keeping your questions for later? And then on a very important announcement.
Well, two important announcements depending on your current needs. The first is that there is coffee there, and you could take a cup of coffee, and we shall continue at 7 o'clock in another room, which is much larger. The other is that the thing that you may want to know is that the loo, you go ground floor, you cross the hall, and you ask again.
I've been asked if I would chair this session, which I'm very glad to do. I'm completely incapable of doing it, I think, and keeping all the speakers on time in so interesting a discussion. The first speaker is actually absent, I understand, but nevertheless he's here in voice. And so our first speaker, it's going to be very difficult for me to keep him down to time, so to shut him off, is actually Robert MacDonald. So I'd like to introduce him to you as a Canadian freelance writer. All the information is there. There's no point in my repeating it again. So I'll turn you over to Robert MacDonald, or somebody.
Good morning. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person, but I had a prayer commitment in Athens, and therefore I have undertaken to pre-record my talk for you this morning on Greek political attitudes and policies towards Turkey and Cyprus. I'll plunge straight in so that we don't waste any further time. 3 psychological factors underpin Greek attitudes to the Turks. First, they were subject to the Ottomans for 400 years. There is thus a subliminal resentment of all things Turkish, and this has not been cured by a century and a half of independence. Second, the Greeks are Christians and the Turks Muslims. There's an element of prejudice against the infidels, which, while it may not be articulate, nevertheless exists. Third, there is the matter of size. At the time of the birth of the modern Turkish Republic in the 1920s, Greece had a population of the order of 7 million, while Turkey had only twice that number. Today, Greece has a population of just over 10 million, while Turkey has grown to 56 million, getting on for 6 times the size of Greece. By the turn of the century, the population of Istanbul alone will be roughly equivalent to that of the whole of Greece. The Greeks feel swamped. They fear being overwhelmed. And because of this psychological reaction, they imagine that Turkey has designs to regain territory that once was Turkish, but which currently is Greek. The islands of the eastern Aegean and the mainland territory of Thrace are areas of particular concern. The Turks, for their part, portray the Greeks as expansionists, citing Greek nationalist activity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was fueled by the Megalia there, the notion of a greater Greece uniting all the Hellenistic peoples of the eastern Mediterranean. The Greeks shook off the Ottoman yoke, first in Thessaly, then in Epirus, Macedonia, Thrace, and the islands of the Aegean. Crete rose up and expelled its Turkish community. The island of Cyprus, which has been predominantly Greek-speaking since the 12th century BC, was the next logical extension. However, at the turn of the century, Cyprus was under British administration, having been ceded to the UK by the Ottomans in 1878. During World War I, the UK offered Cyprus to Greece if it would ally itself in the war against Germany. The Greek monarch, Constantine I, had pro-German sympathies and refused. This led to his temporary removal from the throne and the creation of an alternative government, which joined the Allied cause. But the chance of gaining Cyprus was lost, and it became a British Crown colony in 1925. After the war, Greece was given administrative control over Smyrna and a large territory of the Anatolian hinterland, but it was exhausted by its war efforts and by domestic faction fighting, and was driven out by Turkish nationalists in a disastrous rout at Smyrna in 1922. There followed a massive population exchange of 1.3 million Greek Orthodox Christians and 390,000 Muslims. The 1923 peace agreement, the Treaty of Lausanne, defined the boundaries of the modern state until the cession of the Dodecanese Islands to Greece by Italy in 1947. During the interwar years, relations between Greece and Turkey were equable. They remained so until the early 1950s, when they were soured because of Cyprus. As European empires began to crumble in the wake of the war, Cypriot nationalists began to campaign for self-determination, which in their terms meant enosis or union with Greece. This was resisted by the Turkish Cypriot community, who comprised 20% of the population and who did not wish to become a minority under Greek domination. It was also resisted by Turkey, which did not relish the idea of another Hellenistic island so close to its shores. The UK, which had established major military bases in Cyprus, resisted granting independence for longer than it did in some other parts of its empire. Finally, however, it devised a scheme by which it created on the south coast of the island 2 sovereign base areas from which it could carry out its defense activities while granting independence to the rest of Cyprus. The 1960 Independence Constitution called for power sharing between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. The system broke down 3 years later amid bloody intercommunal fighting, which led to the Turkish Cypriots retreating into defensive enclaves. Turkey threatened to invade, but lacked the landing craft with which to successfully stage an assault. Greece secretly infiltrated 10,000 troops onto the island to counter any invasion, but could not provide them with air cover. Hostilities reached standoff in late summer 1964 when the Greeks and Greek Cypriots demonstrated that they could more or less move at will against Turkish Cypriot positions on the ground, and the Turks demonstrated that they were not prepared to allow this to happen by using planes based on the mainland to napalm and strafe Greek forces. There was a 3-year lull in hostilities while US and UN mediators sought to find a solution, and Greece and Turkey entered into secret negotiations for a settlement. The Turks wanted some form of joint sovereignty over the island. The Greeks persisted in pursuing enosis. The military coup in Greece in April 1967 exacerbated tensions. The army-backed regime declared attainment of enosis to be one of its principal objectives, although the junta was divided between those who were prepared to confront Turkey to attain it and those who thought it could be negotiated. In November 1967, General George Grievous, the former independence fighter who'd become commander of the Greek Cypriot National Guard and the Greek clandestine forces on the island, launched an attack on 2 Turkish Cypriot villages, killing 20 people. Turkey mobilized and was only prevented from invading Cyprus by heavy storms. Turkey moved substantial forces up to its border with Greece in Thrace with a view to a confrontation on the mainland if needs be. The crisis was diffused by US shuttle diplomacy, but the Turkish terms to stand down its invasion force included the withdrawal of the 10,000 illicit Greek troops in Cyprus. After this fiasco, the Greek junta faction, which favored a negotiated settlement in Cyprus, gained the upper hand. Efforts were made to refurbish diplomatic contacts with Turkey, and between 1968 and 1972, relations were correct, albeit guarded. Indeed, the Greek junta got on well with the non-party government installed in Ankara after the 1971 military pronunciamento, and junta leader George Papadopoulos went so far as to talk about the long-term possibility of a federation between the two nations. Talks were held in a NATO context towards a Cyprus solution. However, when these failed, lightly buried tensions were resurrected. They quickened following the overthrow in 1973 of Papadopoulos. His successor, Dimitrios Ioannidis, was of the faction who felt Cyprus could be taken by force, and in July 1974, Greek officers seconded to command the Greek Cypriot National Guard staged a coup against Cyprus President Archbishop Makarios. This provided Ankara with the excuse that it had so long wanted to intervene militarily in Cyprus in order to establish a presence there. The Greek regime seemed to think that American diplomacy would prevent Turkish military intervention as it had in 1964 and again in 1967. But it failed, and Turkey, in two waves of invasion in July and August 1974, seized the northern third of Cyprus, driving out the Greek Cypriot inhabitants of the territory and providing a haven in the area for the Turkish Cypriot population of the island. Over the course of years, all the elements of a separate state have been created in the region. It has its own constitution, executive, legislature, judiciary, central bank, police, and defense forces. Turkish aid has been used to create air and seaports, highways, and a telecommunications network, public housing, water supply, and electricity supply. In 1983, the area declared itself to be the independent Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, though no nation recognizes its state, Turkey. Greeks feel themselves to be the aggrieved party over Cyprus. They tend to gloss over the coup against Makarios or to ascribe it to the military regime, which they claim was not representative of the popular will. Up to a point, this is true, but had the coup been successful and innocence attained, there would have been few, if any, who would have repudiated it. Though Cyprus has been a long-standing factor of division between Greece and Turkey, the breakdown in bilateral relations dates from 1974, when commercially exploitable quantities of oil were proven in the northern Aegean Sea. Turkey issued exploration licenses to its state-owned Turkish Petroleum Corporation, covering parts of the Aegean seabed to the west of the islands of the Greek archipelago. Greece protested, claiming that each island has its own continental shelf, a position which would give it control over the greater part of the Aegean seabed. Turkey countered that there is a natural prolongation of the Turkish continental shelf, which extends to near the median line of the Aegean. It argues that the Greek islands merely sit over this, with no seabed rights of their own. The seabed dispute has become confounded with the issue of territorial waters. Under international law, Greece has the right to declare 12-mile territorial waters. However, if it did this in the Aegean, it would block high seas passage from the Mediterranean to the west coast Turkish port of Izmir and to the Dardanelles and the Black Sea. Thus, Turkey insists that if Greece were to extend its territorial waters to 12 miles, it would consider this a cause for war. As long ago as 1931, Greece declared 10 miles airspace. This is unusual, as airspace ordinarily coincides with territorial waters. The issue did not become contentious, however, until the dispute with Turkey over territorial waters. Now, Turkey pointedly refuses to recognize the extended airspace, and its warplanes regularly fly through the outer 4 miles during military maneuvers. Greece believes it has international law on its side over the seabed issue and has repeatedly suggested adjudication by the International Court at The Hague. Turkey argues that the principle of equity should apply and that the matter should be settled by bilateral negotiations. By mutual consent, the two sides have agreed not to prospect the seabed outside existing territorial waters, although Greece reserves the right to do so. Reiteration of this principle in 1987 prompted Turkey to send an exploration vessel into the Aegean, escorted by a flotilla of warships. Greece made as though to respond, and a confrontation was only prevented after intervention by NATO. The following year, the then Greek and Turkish Prime Ministers, Andreas Papandreou and Turgut Özal, meeting in the context of the annual economic forum at Davos in Switzerland, concluded what they termed a no-war pact. They proposed to set aside their major differences and to embark upon a series of confidence-building measures which might pave the way to eventual resolution of the larger issues. The process was supposed to be accompanied by a series of heads of government meetings. but it was unpopular with Greek public opinion, and when the first meeting between Papandreou and Özal took place in Athens in June 1988, Papandreou was forced to try to put Cyprus on the agenda. Özal said that this was not part of the process, and responded by trying to discuss the seabed issue. The meeting ended with nothing accomplished, and the so-called spirit of Davos has since dissipated. Greece sees the Turkish claims to the seabed as the thin end of the wedge towards claiming Aegean islands as well. Prior to the Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey lobbied hard for Greece not to be given control over the large islands which rim its coastline. Since, Turkish irredentists have frequently called for their restitution. Only recently, Prime Minister Turgut Özal described as an historical mistake the cession of the Dodecanese group of islands to Greece by Italy. Greece is anxious about the Turkish Fourth Army, headquartered at Izmir. The unit was established in 1975 and has since come to be known colloquially as the Aegean Army. Its composition is not clear, although in 1976 its commander described it as a force of over 100,000 men with striking capacity. Latterly, the Turkish General Staff has described it as a training establishment with no combat capacity. Air Force training does take place at Izmir, and though there is no naval base at the port, landing craft are stationed nearby. Greek military authorities claim that Turkish manpower and armaments in the region total some 150,000 men, and they insist that the Fourth Army is a potential invasion force. Their suspicions are fueled by the fact that the Aegean Army is not assigned to NATO. Greece, for its part, began reinforcing the Aegean Islands as long ago as 1964, when the Turks first began talking about invading Cyprus. Tourist airports have been hardened to take military planes, and Greece now has a chain of military airfields running in a north-south line through the Aegean, from Kavala on the mainland to the islands of Skiros, Thira, Karpathos, and Rhodes. Former Conservative Prime Minister Konstantin Karamanlis ordered the strengthening of the shore defences of the islands and assigned 30,000 troops to reinforce their garrisons. He also created Greece's own Fourth Army Corps, headquartered at Xanthi in Thrace. The Panhellenic Socialist Movement government claimed that it considered the primary threat to Greece not to come from the communist nations of the Warsaw Pact, but from Turkey. It declared what it called a new defence doctrine with an eastwards orientation. It never spelled out precisely what this meant, but equipment acquisitions have concentrated on planes and vessels which would be suitable for defence of the islands. The present Conservative government has said nothing which would alter this policy. Turkey complains that this militarization of the islands breaches the conditions of the Treaty of Lausanne, which said that there should be only security forces, not armed forces, on the Greek islands of Lemnos and Samothrace at the mouth of the Dardanelles. It also said that there should be only local recruits on the 4 islands closest to the Turkish coast. That's Lesvos, Chios, Samos, and Ikaria. Greece claims that the 1936 Montreux Convention allowed for remilitarization of the islands of the Straits, although this is contested by Turkey. The Greek case would appear to be sound on the matter of the islands at the mouth of the Dardanelles, but the concentration of forces on the other 4 islands appears to breach treaty obligations. Furthermore, the Treaty of Paris, by which Greece was assigned the Dodecanese Islands, specified that these should be demilitarized. The maintenance of Greek troops on these islands is in clear breach of treaty conditions. Greece argues, however, that it has an overriding right of legitimate self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Ankara says this is meant to apply only in the event of aggression, and since there has been none, this is a distortion of the meaning of the Charter. Greece notes that Turkey had declared its intention to create the Aegean Army even before the invasion of Cyprus, and argues that the continued presence of Turkish troops in Cyprus in contravention of the Treaty of Guarantee under which the invasion was carried out gives ample grounds for it taking reasonable defensive measures to protect the Aegean Islands. After the invasion of Cyprus, Greece withdrew for a time from the integrated military structure of NATO. When it became apparent, however, that Turkey was gaining advantages in Greece's absence, the Greek government sought reinstatement. This raised issues concerning command and control arrangements over sea and air activities in the Aegean. Prior to withdrawal, Greece had been responsible for air defense. Prior to withdrawal, Greece had been responsible for air and sea defense throughout the whole of the Aegean west of Turkey's 6-mile limit, or the median line in the case of the narrower channels between the eastern islands and the mainland. After withdrawal, Greece became responsible only for its own territorial waters and airspace. Greece argued that as it was returning to the alliance without there having been any move on Turkey's part to withdraw troops from Cyprus, It should not be expected to pay any price for re-entry and should regain its former command and control responsibilities. Turkey complained that this was typical of the Greek effort to turn the Aegean into a Greek lake and argued in favor of command arrangements giving it a role in air and sea space to the west of Greek islands. Greece argued that this would make Turkey responsible for the defense of Greek territory, which it said was a strategic and political impossibility. After prolonged negotiations, it was agreed that Greece would rejoin NATO with a new land and air headquarters established at Larissa, paralleling those at Izmir in Turkey. Details of the command and control arrangements were to be worked out after the fact. Greece re-entered the alliance in 1980, but the command and control arrangements have yet to be resolved. Greece has repeatedly tried to have the squadron of aircraft and supporting troops which are stationed on the island of Lemnos assigned to NATO, arguing that this would provide a strategic second line of defense for the Dardanelles. Turkey views it as a potential point of assault on its most vital line of communication and regularly vetoes the Greek response to the planning questionnaire for NATO's Defense Review Committee. On political grounds, Greece counter-vetoes Turkey's response, with the result that on paper at least, neither country has forces committed to the alliance. Greece refuses to participate in alliance exercises in the Aegean which fail to include maneuvers to defend Lemnos. NATO conducts Aegean exercises regardless, but Greece refuses to let the forces of other NATO nations utilize alliance or national facilities during such exercises. Greece's other major concern regarding Turkey is that of the minorities. First, there is the Greek minority in Turkey. Some 200,000 Greeks remained there after the Treaty of Lausanne. But over the course of years, they've been pressured to quit, and their numbers have dwindled to about 5,000. They were the target of riotous attacks in 1955, in which hundreds of businesses and homes were destroyed. In 1964, the Turkish authorities passed a law preventing the sale or rental of Greek property assets in Turkey. This was rescinded during the Davos process, but other bureaucratic obstacles meant that it has proved virtually impossible for Greeks to export their capital. There's been similar attrition of the Greek communities on the two Turkish islands of Gökçeada, pardon my pronunciation, I think it's Gökçeada, which in Greek is Imbros, and Boşkada, or Tenebos. These were inhabited in the early years of the century by some 9,000 and 5,400 Greeks, respectively. Under the Treaty of Lausanne, the islands came under Turkish administration, but there were to be special rights for Greeks regarding local representation, policing, and education. The Greek communities flourished until Cyprus erupted when the special rights were withdrawn and large tracts of Greek-owned land were expropriated for an open prison. It's estimated that the numbers on these islands have now been reduced to around 2,500 and 1,400 respectively. The other minority concern is that of the 120,000 Muslims of Turkish extraction remaining in western Thrace. They lived in relative tranquility in this sparsely populated area until Cyprus inflamed nationalist tensions. Since, they've been discriminated against by the Greek authorities in matters of education, religion, and bureaucratic controls. The Muslim community has, as a consequence, become militant, and since 1989 has elected its own independent members to parliament instead of supporting candidates from mainstream Greek parties. The Greek authorities argue that the agitation is fostered by Ankara and that the Turkish government is stirring up nationalist fervor amongst this Thracian minority in the same way that it did among the Turkish Cypriot minority in the 1950s. And they say that they have a long-term view to declaring a right to intervene in order to protect their kinsmen, as they ultimately did in Cyprus. For the past 3 decades, there's been a balance of power maintained in the Aegean by the United States, which has been the military mentor of the two NATO allies. Since 1978, it's provided military aid to Greece and Turkey in a ratio of 7 to 10. Successive Republican administrations in Washington have sought to break this ratio, believing that Turkey deserved greater assistance than Greece. The effort has been thwarted, however, by a pro-Greek lobby in Congress. This could now change. The Bush administration is anxious to reward Turkey for its role in the Gulf War and has made it clear that this year it intends to provide substantially greater aid for Turkey than for Greece. The Greek lobby is again working hard to prevent this, but Turkey is currently popular on Capitol Hill, and the ratio could well be broken. Greece's main counterweight to this is its membership of the European Community. By using its power of veto within community councils, it's so far been able to block Turkey's 1988 application for membership and to promote the advancement of Cyprus, which is also a candidate. Greek public pronouncements regarding Turkey often appear exaggerated. They arise, however, out of genuine fear that Turkey has designs on Greek territory. This is almost certainly not the case, but the continued presence of Turkish troops in northern Cyprus does nothing to allay great concern. Thank you, and again I apologize for not being able to be with you.
Bravo.
Quite a lot of material that I would otherwise have had to cover, and so I'm able to leave, I hope, a certain amount of time for discussion eventually. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to come here and address such a knowledgeable audience on this subject, which is of great concern to all of us and all those who hope for peaceful resolution of the Cyprus problem. I've been myself connected with Cyprus now for some 36 years, I calculated. I actually happened to be in Cyprus when AOCA started throwing the first bombs of its campaign. They missed me, and I went on to Turkey and spent the next year or so there, and was able to gauge and begin to appreciate the depth of feeling which these events in Cyprus were generating in Turkey. I have vivid memories of when I was going to Turkish language classes. One person, an elderly poet that I used to go to, was married to a retired general. And when she went to make coffee, he used to put pepper pots and salt pots on the table, and with a map, and he showed this map of Cyprus pointing like a dagger at the bosom of Turkey. And so I began to appreciate the depth of feeling that there was on this subject. Later I lived in Cyprus for a couple of years, left there on Independence Day, and was again in Turkey for a couple of years during a period of considerable tension when, as we've heard, there were attempts, or it was thought that Turkey would like to invade Cyprus in order to protect its community there. I remember being in a car with a great demonstration swirling all around us against the Americans at that time after Johnson had sent his infamous letter to Inanu. And since then I've had an opportunity to maintain my contacts and learn what Turkish officials feel and what the Turkish people feel on this subject. But I should stress that I'm in no way an official representative or spokesman for Turkey, but I just hope that I will be able to give a reasonably objective and dispassionate view of their opinions on this subject. And I thought what I could most usefully do to avoid going over the ground that has already been covered would be briefly to mention perhaps a couple of misconceptions as I see them. Note very briefly what may colour Turkish attitudes. Some of this is already coming across from what we've already heard. And then the main substance of what I have to say is the Turkish view on the best way forward towards a solution, and then perhaps conclude with some general observations. As far as misconceptions go, it seems to be somewhat a mirror image of what we've heard from Mr. MacDonald about the Greek view of the Turks. To put it at its strongest, I suppose there are some Greeks who feel that Turkey is a threat to them, to their existence, and it wants to take over the whole island. And from what we've heard, some of them would think take over even more than Cyprus. And so the response, quite naturally, is that the Greeks must arm, the Greek Cypriots must arm to prevent that happening. Well, seen from the Turkish point of view, this is incomprehensible. They take the view that had they wanted to take the whole island, they could have done so. They see that their troops are there in order to safeguard the community, the Turkish Cypriot community, that was seen to be in danger of annihilation after 1974, or in 1974. They themselves do want a settlement, despite what might be thought. The Turks are very keen to secure a settlement in Cyprus because Cyprus is an economic and military burden to them,
and it's something they would be happy to be without. But they are not prepared to do that at the risk of betraying what they regard as their kith and kin. I'll say a little more about that later. Second misconception, I think, is that the Turkish Cypriot community and the Turkish Cypriot leadership is a mere puppet of Ankara. I know that it could be argued that the Turkish Cypriots are dependent upon Turkey for both military and economic survival. But I think it might help us to clear our minds on the subject if we just consider the same thing is true of Israel. And no one would think that Israel, which is dependent on the United States, is necessarily entirely subservient to the United States when it comes to any peace negotiations in the Middle East. And moreover, in the personality of Ralph Denktash, there is there a figure who has been on the world stage for probably longer than any other person I can think of. He's seen all sorts of Turkish, Greek and other national leaders, presidents, prime ministers come and go, and he's survived them all. And he's used to dealing in these international fora and speaking on international platforms. And his word, whether you like it or not, does carry quite a lot of weight. And it's something which Turkish governments would ignore at their peril. So this is a factor which needs to be borne in mind. He's a powerful, skillful, and indeed an elected representative of his people. Well, now, what colours Turkish attitudes? A lot of this has already come across from Mr. MacDonald. The Lausanne Conference, before that, the Greek invasion of Asia Minor, and the subsequent War of Independence or Liberation in Turkey, the Lausanne Conference and the Lausanne Peace Treaty, and then after that the restoration of cordial relations, or reasonably cordial relations, as a result of the efforts of Atatürk and Venizelos. But eventually, of course, the different processes of breakdown that have already been elaborated have soured those relations. Another consideration is the strategic one, and that is now of less importance since the demise of communism than it had been for many years, but it was so much entrenched in Turkish thinking that there's still a residual effect there in the attitudes of Turkey towards this problem. The main problem is, as seen from Turkey, is that the Greek and Greek Cypriot resort to violence has made them feel that their community there and Turkish interests are definitely under threat from Greece. And this is the main nub of the problem as far as Turkey is concerned. If only the problem of security could be resolved, then the logjam would be broken. If something could be done to make the Turkish Cypriot community feel secure and safe, then the logjam would be broken and Turkey would be more than willing to go halfway. Now, to come to the proposed way forward, Turkey considers that this should take place in a number of distinct phases. Phase one would be the development of an outline overall agreement. The second phase would be to negotiate the details of that agreement, leading to a federal constitution. And phase three would be the transitional phase for the implementation and establishment of federation at an agreed date. So they are the distinct phases, and Turks feel that it's important that these should not be allowed to become indistinct. As far as the federal arrangements are concerned, the Turkish view is that they should be based on political equality and partnership. That the principle of bi-communality should be accepted, and also bi-zonality. And they point out that that's already been defined in detail with the United Nations Secretariat. And then each side would agree to the proposals through a separate referendum. The sort of constitution which the Turks have in mind would involve a president and vice president drawn from the respective communities, rotating, and each to have a power of veto. There would be a federal executive with a president, a vice president, and a jointly appointed cabinet. The president and the minister for foreign affairs should never both be drawn from the same community, so they would have to rotate as well. The federal government would have limited powers, and the residual powers would, of course, remain within with the two communal forms of government. The federal legislative would comprise an upper house with equal numbers from the two communities, and a lower house where there would be agreed ratios, but legislation would have to be passed by both houses. The federal judiciary would work on the basis of numerical equality. That is the scheme in broad outline. Basically, to come back to one or two of the other points, these all depend on security. Effective guarantees would have to be made for security, and one way of achieving that would be to have equal Turkish and Greek mainland contingents on the island, equal Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot units on the island, leading eventually, as relations began to warm, to a balanced reduction on both sides, and the whole thing to be subject to supervision and verification by the guarantor powers. I see my time is drawing to a close, so I'll hurry through. The territorial arrangements to be made would have to, again, to ensure security and economic viability of the two communities. As far as reciprocal property claims are concerned, this could be dealt with, provided there was the necessary goodwill, on a basis of exchange or compensation. For economic arrangements, of which we've heard interesting papers this morning, they recognize that it will be necessary to remove the disparity between the two communities, to promote the development in the north, and to safeguard the Turkish Cypriots against adverse economic effects of reunification. And as far as EC membership is concerned, they feel that this is a matter which would require the consent of both communities. So, in short, provided there is, as they see it, a positive change in relationships, there is everything to go for. Who needs to be persuaded in Turkey? Just to sum up, well, of course, public opinion needs to be carried along in Turkey. It could not be expected to accept what might be described as a sellout, but nevertheless, the will is there when there's no great tension between Greece and Turkey, or between or over Cyprus. The will is there in Turkey to achieve a settlement. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs obviously needs to be convinced that any arrangement would be satisfactory, and I would note in passing that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Turkey constitutes something of an elite which has managed to more or less maintain Turkish foreign policy despite changes of government over many years. And finally, I'll just mention the position of the president himself, President Özal. He, of course, would have to be convinced that he could persuade his people to go along with this solution. His own position is that he's well disposed, as we saw that he was involved in the Davos agreements. He has shown remarkable boldness in a number of instances in leading, or in fact, indeed, going against public opinion in such matters as Turkey's participation in the Gulf War. But he's electorally weak and needs a boost. The Cyprus, the settlement on Cyprus on good terms could actually help him. And we know that next month President Bush is visiting Turkey, and it's already being announced that he's going to be putting strong pressure on Turgut Özal to settle. If this is not delicately handled, it could all turn sour, but nevertheless it still does present possibilities and opportunities there. And basically, the Turks, I think, would be very happy if the Greeks and the Greek Cypriots, although they regard this essentially as a matter for solution between the two communities, I should stress that. This is a problem to be solved by the consent of the two communities, not to be imposed by either government, but they feel that if the Greek side can come up with a better alternative to the present situation, one that, I should say again, guarantees the life and security of the Turkish Cypriot community, then the Turkish people say they will be very eager to grasp any hand of friendship that's offered. And I think they often ask themselves in this situation, what is it the Greeks really want? Do the Greeks want a victory, or do they want an amicable settlement? Thank you very much.
I think our arrangement is to keep questions to the end, so I'll now call upon Christopher Price.
Perhaps I could first say just a little bit about myself and how I became interested in this problem. I went to school a few yards from here, Leeds Grammar School, and was subjected, as young men of my age were in those days, to an uninterrupted diet of Latin, Greek and ancient history between the ages of about 13 and 21. And so that gave me a sort of cultural interest in the subject. It also gave me an interest in politics. The whole classical sixth of Leeds Grammar School joined the Labour Party in 1948 on the grounds that Pericles had said intellectuals ought to take part in politics, and we felt we were becoming intellectuals. So I found myself a Labour MP on and off for 20 years. I taught Latin and Greek for 10 years and then had nearly 20 years in the House of Commons. During that period, in 1974, the House of Commons set up a select committee to examine the Cyprus problem, and I was put on that committee and distinguished myself by not being terribly nice to my Foreign Secretary, Mr. Callaghan, when he was being interviewed by the committee, which didn't exactly help my political career, but got me interested in Cyprus, in which I've been particularly interested, really ever since visiting the island at least once or twice a year, and until 1983 visiting the Turkish Cypriot part of the island. But owing to an article I wrote in the New Statesman, I've been told I will be subject to the full rigour of the law of the Turkish Cypriot administration, and so I felt it prudent not to go back there, which I'm very sad about. In 1983, I was also swept away in the Thatcherian general election tide, and so returned to my roots and came back to Leeds to run small establishment over the motorway called Leeds Polytechnic, which seems to manage on the same number of students but half the budget of Liverpool. I want to do a political analysis of Britain's attitude towards Cyprus, Greece and Turkey, but I want to start not so much with a political analysis, but with an element of psychoanalysis, because I do think the psychological elements of this are at the root of Britain's attitude towards it. I shall go back a bit in history, but one has to remember this is a history of a decline in the power of Britain. And I do suspect that the influence of Britain over the Cyprus settlement is very, very much weaker than it ever has been in the past. And other institutions, particularly the European Economic Community, have very much greater influence over a settlement than Britain. It's one of the problems about Britain's attitude towards Greece and Turkey is what Carl Jung talked about, the animar and the animus. It's with their hearts they're Greek, and with their heads they're Turks. With their hearts they're Greek partly because the British ruling class for 250 years has been educated in a extremely sort of force-fed way in ancient Greek culture, and has transferred this romantic, Byronic view of ancient Greek culture, particularly after 1827 and the Battle of Navarino, into a belief in the modern Greek state. Critics of this view say there's very little connection between Periclean Athens and Papandrean Athens, but nevertheless, it's a clear psychological feel of a lot of British statesmen through the ages that they ought to be pro-Greek. Wrapped up with that is a feeling that they're pretty imperialist also. I mean, Lord Elgin, who felt himself being pro-Greek, felt also happy to saw great chunks off the Parthenon and bring them back to the British Museum, because clearly his great interest was in British imperialism rather than in Greece or Turkey. But nevertheless, there is this heart element, which occasionally blows up in untoward events, like the Battle of Navarino, when the British and the Russians came together to sink the Turkish fleet. On the other side, on the head element, in terms of British interests, British political and economic interests, for 300 years, their interests have had to be pro-Turkish in order to defend the Suez Canal against, I was going to say Soviet, I don't mean that, I mean Russian infiltration. Ever since the trade routes to India were established, the British government have felt the defense of those trade routes overcame all other romantic political associations, and they've always, for that reason, seen it necessary to bolster Turkey, whoever runs Turkey, in order to keep the Soviet Union out of the Eastern Mediterranean. And you can trace that thread through hundreds of years of British history. So, in those, it seems to me, that picture represents the fundamental schizophrenia of Britain towards Greece and Turkey, and particularly of British politicians. And they have great arguments about this. In this century, and particularly since the Second World War, another player has entered upon the scene. And since the Second World War, and of course particularly since Suez, but before Suez as well, Britain has not been able to take decisions in the way it did before the Second World War, and the connection between Britain and the United States of America in foreign policy has become predominant, and it's quite impossible to understand Britain's attitude towards foreign policy since the Second World War unless you understand the relationship between MI6 and the CIA fundamentally, the secret nature of the symbiotic cooperation between the two great English-speaking nations, who by that time had other objections to the fear of the Soviet Union since Churchill's Iron Curtain speech after the Second World War was not just that they'd interfere with the trade routes to India, but that they'd take over Europe. And just so that the next stage of British imperialism became totally wrapped up with the Cold War, and that all British attitudes towards Cyprus since that change have to be looked at in that framework. If I could just take just 3 examples as illustrations. Henry Hopkinson's speech in July 1954, when he said Cyprus could never become independent. He didn't quite put it like that. He said there are some nations which can never be fully independent. But the use of the word never in the House of Commons is an extremely foolish word to utter in these matters, and it has gone down in history. But he used the word never quite advisedly. His advisors had told him he must use the word never because because the island of Cyprus was of such strategic importance, partly because they could see NASA coming into Egypt, and it was being prepared as the new Suez base to defend the eastern Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. And the row that the never produced actually, in the end, produced Macmillan's Wind of Change speech 5 years later and made Britain re-examine her whole attitude towards the empire. But in a sense, Henry Hopkinson was right, at least he's right up to now, and that Cyprus never has been fully independent. And it's never been fully independent because it's so vital, it's perceived as so vital to British and American foreign interests. The second example was the 1960 Treaty of Establishment, where the whole of Cyprus didn't become the Republic of Cyprus, and 2 chunks of Cyprus, the 2 bases in Episcopi and Decalia, were kept out. There was a lot of argument about it, and Makarios did not want to sign at Lancaster House simply for this one reason, and negotiated hard, and the final British position was at least 99.5 square miles and at least 2 bases. Anyway, that's what they agreed, and if you actually measure the 2 bases, they are exactly 99.5 square miles, and there's 2 of them. Actually, Makarios said no more than 2. Actually, there's 4 bases. There's Akriteria, Episcopi, Decalia, and Ios Nikolaos. But they joined them by little corridors and pretended there were 2. And then kept all sorts of other little bits of Cyprus, like the listening station on Troodos. Now, that arrangement, unique in the world, of a base for which the imperial power pays no rent and there's no review period. When I asked a question in the House of Commons, what are the British bases? The answer came out, they're residual parts of the Crown Colony of Cyprus. And the matter can probably only be resolved in the Decolonisation Committee of the United Nations. But the bases were there because of British and US political interests. And they rapidly became, it wasn't so much the troops who were stationed there, it was the electronic listening devices that were placed there that not only looked at and listened to the Soviet Union, but listened to all the radio traffic of the Eastern Mediterranean. And now technology has overcome the bases now. You can listen to all this traffic from satellites. But they were important at the time. The third instance is the 1974 Turkish, I won't say, because this is a very even-handed discussion, the Turkish événement. I suppose is the most neutral way you can call 1974. And on that occasion, it is the British were in a great dilemma, partly because there was a general election coming up, and the great boast between 64 and 70 that under a Labour government no British soldier had died abroad, and they didn't want it to happen again. They didn't want to get into a war. But the British security services knew perfectly well that the CIA knew perfectly well that the Turks were going to invade. And the instructions to try to control the invasion but not to interfere with it were absolute, because it was seen on the whole as a reasonable solution, that the partition of Cyprus had been foreseen for some time by the British and the American, I don't say the State Department because they behaved impeccably throughout, but the other side of American foreign policy, the CIA, had been seen as the most sensible solution. So that's the second thing to realize, that once Britain was in alliance with America, its policy was very, very controlled by the United States. The next change was the European Economic Community, and I see this as a very positive change when Greece and subsequently Portugal and Spain and Portugal entered the European community with the classic fascist threat: if you don't let us in, we'll go fascist again. And it worked in each case. That edged the power of the Greek side up a bit, and Britain, to its credit, supported Greek entry very, very enthusiastically, because Greece posed no threat. This was one area where the population disparity weighed in Greek favour, because Britain would not support Turkish entry to the EEC so enthusiastically, simply because of the population of Turkey. In fact, although it was said, the Commission has said they wouldn't contemplate the entry of Turkey before the end of the century, some of my friends say they haven't exactly specified which century. So Britain, in being sucked into Europe, has had to change its attitudes towards Greece, Turkey and Cyprus, because it's been sucked away from this NATO-United States symbiotic relationship. And that has been made even stronger by the collapse of the Cold War. And with the collapse of the Cold War, a genuine political dialogue has taken place, in which I suspect the British attitude towards the Cypriot problem, although we can stand by as a potential guarantor midwife, as we did in 1960, I don't think the British influence will be so much important. I've been told I've got 5 minutes, but there is just one other element where British policy is quite important, and that's what I call the politics of international capitalism, or the politics of Polly Peck. Just a short word about this, because it's very important about the British attitudes towards Cyprus. The great disparity in the 1970s was that the Greeks were 20 times better at lobbying the British government than the Turks. And as I put it once, it was an army of Turkish soldiers against Greek lawyers, and the Greeks tended to have the edge after the invasion. In the 1980s, the Turks decided they were going to have a decent PR campaign, and they did, and hired quite a lot of MPs, and got quite a lot of MPs interested. Some of them picked up a bit of property in the north of Cyprus, and the Conservative Party, which was in power throughout the 1980s, took the Turkish case very much more seriously than it had before, and started getting contributions from Turks who were interested in Cyprus, one of whom was Azil Nadir. And they encouraged Nadir to invest in the north of Cyprus, because I think, and it's a very plausible reason, that if somehow the two economies were to be brought into kilter, as you heard this morning, one way of doing it would be to siphon the profits of Del Monte fruit into northern Cyprus. It couldn't be bad. It wasn't a bad idea. That situation went on and curiously transferred the Greek versus Turkish argument onto the British by-election front. And the first Turkish Cypriot ever to be elected to the House of Commons, Richard Hickmet, lost his seat because of a bit of Greek Cypriot politicking at the general election, and then lost the Eastbourne by-election later because of a bit more politicking. And but what does seem to have happened last year is that the British and American governments rejected that sort of method of trying to boost the economy of the north of Cyprus, turned against Nadir, and decided to prosecute him instead. I'm sure that instead, I mean, I'm sure the institutions of justice worked absolutely properly, but there does seem to have been a swing back in that attitude of trying to get international capital to invest into northern Cyprus and solve the problem that way. I've spoken for far too long. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Allow me to change the line. Instead of dealing with American policies and attitudes vis-à-vis the other countries, I deal first with the Soviet policies. It seems easier. No purpose, it is, as we see, as we go along. No purpose would be served within the framework of this conference by going back to the pre-perestroika period in discussing Soviet policy towards Greece and Turkey. Suffice it to say that this policy was heavily influenced by the confrontation of the Soviet Union and the United States. We could add to that in the case of Turkey, the Soviet Union tried, within the limitations of the above overriding reality, to develop what we would call correct neighborly relations. Since 1985-86, Soviet attitudes and policies vis-à-vis Greece and Turkey have been developed in accordance with the main perestroika principle, that being the one of cooperation with the United States and generally the West. More specifically, in the case of Greece, Soviet policy is influenced by the following factors. One, American military bases, which are still considered a negative factor, can be seen in perspective as losing their importance within the general trend of disaster. Two, historical bonds of friendship and cooperation between the two countries. Three, Greece's membership of the European Economic Community gives another dimension to its overall position, which is taken into account by Soviet foreign policy. It is true that there has been some delay in further development of Soviet-Greek relations in accordance with the new possibilities. Partly, I think, this is explained by the resignation of Mr. Edward Shevardnadze as foreign minister and the readjustments which should have been made anyway by the new foreign minister, Mr. Alexander Bezmerny. But relations are catching up. Already a visit to Moscow by the Greek Prime Minister, Mr. Konstantinos Mitsotakis, has been fixed. Soviet foreign policy attaches very great importance to Turkey, mainly because of its shared borders and its general geographical position. More specifically, one, American military bases in Turkey are more important, but the same approach as in the case of Greece applies here too. Two, direct neighborness gives rise to problems as well as creating opportunities. It calls for efforts to keep a peaceful boundary and to preempt any complication from a possible convergence of dissatisfied elements within Islamic areas in the Soviet Union and Turkey's tendency to exploit sometimes very cleverly such situations wherever they appear. On the other hand, there are great possibilities for the expansion of trade and other economic relations between the two countries. Three, because of its geographical position, Turkey assumes additional strategic importance as a bridge with the Muslim world, underlined in actual practice in the case of the Gulf War. As a result of all these factors, the Soviet Union will strive for considerable development of its relations with Turkey, trying at the same time to keep a balance with its relations with Greece. The Soviet foreign minister has already been to Ankara and President Ozal visited Moscow. Trade between the two countries has expanded considerably, a common feature of Soviet policy vis-à-vis both countries, Greece and Turkey, which incidentally distinguishes itself from that of the American policy, is that it is not affected to any significant degree by the nature of the government in power in either country at any given moment. Cyprus was always looked upon under a completely different prism. If we are going to look for the most important principle of Soviet policy towards Cyprus, that principle would be the preservation and further strengthening of its status of independence. It follows from this that any solution of the Cyprus problem should exclude the union of Cyprus with either state, meaning of course specifically Greece and Turkey, and also partition, if not for any other reason, for the danger that such a solution would entail in leading to double enosis. It is correct to say that in pre-perestroika times, this Soviet position was dictated by the fact that both countries, Greece and Turkey, were members of NATO. Could we draw from this a conclusion that in the new situation, with the changes in NATO, one would expect the Soviet Union to change its basic position against the Union of Cyprus with either of the two countries, as well as that of partition? Most certainly not. The Soviet position for an independent Cyprus derives not only from its overriding stand in support of new independent states, but also from the premise that a solution of union of Cyprus with any of the two mother countries or partition would be a cause of instability in the region. The Soviet Union preferred a solution based on a federal constitutional structure because it believed that only in this way the interests of both communities would be safeguarded. It is worthwhile to remember that it was Andrei Gromyko, the late foreign minister, who spoke first in January 1965 about a federal solution, provoking, as it is known at that time, a furore within the Greek Cypriot community. A well-known argument coming up every now and again is that the Soviet Union did not want the solution of the Cyprus problem because it preferred a festering crisis paralyzing the southeastern wing of NATO. This was mistaken, or at least to a great extent mistaken. Not because the Soviet Union did not want the southeastern wing of NATO to weaken, but because it did not want a situation which could lead to a war, a possible war, between Greece and Turkey, a war which no one would know where it could lead to. One would not fail to notice that the Soviet position on Cyprus is similar to, if not identical, with that of the United Nations. And the proposal for an international conference on Cyprus, put forward by the Soviet Union in the pre-perestroika period, constituted a sincere, I believe, attempt aiming at the cooperation of the big powers as a way for neutralizing Turkish intransigence and finding a solution to the problem. Now, American policies towards Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. The line dividing American policy in relation to Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus before and after perestroika might not be as clear as the one for the Soviet Union, but nevertheless it exists. It is not an exaggeration to say that the United States, both through NATO and through bilateral agreements with the two countries, attached to them greater importance politically and militarily than any other region apart from Germany. In the case of Greece, it is true to say that for years and years, any decision of some significance taken by the government should have had the endorsement of the American ambassador. The importance attached to Greece and Turkey necessarily has decreased with the general change in international relations. But both countries, especially Turkey, still remain within the sphere of direct American influence, mainly through one, the existence of military bases, two, considerable military and financial assistance. Further to that, in the case of Greece, American influence is also exercised through remnants of past strongholds within the status quo. In the case of Turkey, American influence is guaranteed, if not directly through the political status quo, certainly through the army, which still serves as the final power resort. Recently, during a visit to Washington, I, with a group of people, were given a briefing at the White House on American policy regarding Cyprus by officials high up in the State Department and the Council of National Security. The exact words used again and again were that the United States have now excellent relations with the Greek government and excellent relations with the Turkish government. The officials went on to specify, in the case of Greece, that between the American administration and the relatively new government, the Greek government, there are common principles on the basis of which one could look forward to new relationships. Mr. Mitsotakis has been to the States and President Bush is visiting Athens very soon. In the case of Turkey, the same officials said that the administration can communicate effectively, as they put it, with Ankara. President Özal has been to Washington and President Bush, after Athens, will go to Turkey. Any reference to the war in the Gulf would of course underline the words used by the officials to describe American-Turkish relations. It is not an exaggeration to speak of a kind of special relationship between the United States and Turkey, although not to that depth as between Britain and the United States. I must stress that the subject matter of the briefing at the White House was Cyprus. Relations between the administration in Greece on the one hand and the administration in Turkey on the other were referred to as an indication for the relatively favorable conditions existing now for a solution of the Cyprus problem. the impression one could get from those briefings is that it is about time for a determined effort to bring about a solution to this problem. Furthermore, and this is the most important part of it all, that the United States is determined to make its own contribution towards that end. But all this is subordinated to the premise that both sides in the intercommunal talks should respond positively to the United Nations Secretary General's efforts and make the first stop. It was stressed that the two communities must make the necessary effort, that the problem will not be solved by others for them. In further exploring the practicalities for a solution, the same American officials made three additional points. One, that what applied to Greece and Turkey about the excellent relations with Washington applied also to President Vassiliou. That Turkey has promised at the highest level, as they put it, to work for a solution. Three, that even Takis had responded positively to Washington's sounding touches. 2 weeks ago, President Bush met with President Vassiliou, 3 weeks ago, and left no doubt that he will deal with the Cyprus problem, even saying that he would act as a catalyst in creating conditions which could lead to a solution. Ankara's and Takis' reaction has been more in letter than in spirit, in accordance to what was said at the briefing. It is true that President Ozal came out with specific proposal for a four-party, that is governments of Greece and Turkey and the two communities, meeting which can hardly be described as a compromising and constructive spirit. Mr. Takis, on the other hand, limited himself to a statement referring to the two communities instead of the well-known stand about two peoples in Cyprus, each one entitled to the right of self-determination, which led to the breakdown of the intercommunal talks in March 1990. The Greek Cypriot side reply to President Ozal's idea about a four-party meeting was a proposal to bring into such a meeting the 5 permanent members of the Security Council as well. This was in turn rejected by Ankara. It is quite obvious that a wide gap exists between the positions of the two sides, and that an outside factor must be used effectively if that gap is going to be bridged. Could that factor be the United States? Of course it could. Washington has got the ways as well as the means, in consultations with the United Nations Secretary General and the Security Council, to use its influence on Turkey for a more accommodating stand on the basic issues of 1. The withdrawal of the army and the settlers, 2. The unilateral right of intervention, 3. The territorial question and the return of the refugees, 4. The rights of movement, of settlement and property. Do we see a possibility of the United States using its full weight in bringing about such a change in Ankara's position? It is very difficult to give a straight answer to that. It will depend on so many factors, the main one being the great importance that Washington still attaches to Turkey as a reliable ally in a region which is still in a crisis. President Bush's forthcoming visits to Athens and Ankara will give us a clear indication about the extent the United States can go. Thank you.
I think we have about a quarter of an hour, am I right, for discussion. So it's open to the floor. Is that right?
Yes, sorry, I wanted to ask a question. Am I allowed?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I was very interested in what Mr. Norton was saying about the perceptions of the Turkish government, especially the Turkish Foreign Ministry, and especially with regard to the need for maintaining Turkish Cypriot security. But I'd like to ask Mr. Norton, but also our chairman, who is also an expert, I believe, in Turkish affairs, and they may have different views on the matter, is whether there isn't in the minds of Turkish policymakers any idea that perhaps the security of the Turkish Cypriots might best be served in their welfare, etc., through some measures who do not provoke and create hostile feelings among Greek Cypriots, like, for example, the presence of Turkish troops. For it seems to me that, I accept that the Turkish Cypriot community are much more secure than ever before, and they must not get less secure. But as long as the Greek Cypriots feel so insecure, this makes them want to arm and try to defend themselves. So I'm wondering whether in your contacts with Turkish officials or Turkish politicians or intellectuals, understand they're important in Turkey, unlike Britain, don't you ever get people who say, yes, what we've got to do is to help the Turkish community and also the Greek Cypriots to develop better relations among themselves, and perhaps the presence of Turkish troops and Greek troops won't be conducive to this very laudable aim? I'd like to answer. Yes, please.
I think this does get to the core of the matter. Again, from the Turkish point of view, they cannot understand why the presence of Turkish troops on Cyprus at present should be regarded as a hostile act towards the Greek Cypriots or towards the Greeks, because they feel, they're quite convinced that those troops are there not with any further aggressive intent, but they are there because without them they feel that the Turkish Cypriot community is at risk of being attacked. And of course they look back on previous times when the security of the Turkish Cypriots was left to the British. Again, the British didn't do a great deal to stop intercommunal violence in Cyprus. It was unable to stop it. There were those few brief years in the early years of the Republic, but then after December 1963, the deterioration led to attacks on Turkish Cypriot villages and other communities, and so the United Nations forces were brought in. United Nations forces also proved to be inadequate as far as the Turks are concerned to protect the Turkish Cypriot community, so they feel, at least under the present situation, the intercommunal violence has stopped. The presence of Turkish troops there means that there will not be conflicts, armed clashes between the two communities, because on the Greek side they realize it's not worth their while trying to attack, and on the Turkish side the Turks have got their security in the north, and they're not going to let Turkish Cypriots go over, not that they think they would want to, but to attack the Greek side. So they see the presence of Turkish troops there not in any way as a hostile act, but as a means of maintaining the peace. Now, when it comes in the latest publications that have appeared about the forthcoming talks with Bush and Özal on his tour, it's suggested that perhaps the United Nations or some other multinational force might be brought in to provide that degree of security. This would require, in my opinion, a very great deal of persuasion before the Turks could feel sufficiently secure. And I think I'd be interested to get the views of Turkish Cypriots on this too, but I think many Turkish Cypriots that I know feel that they do look to those troops to guarantee their safety. So it would be a major leap forward. And the way in which Turkey sees this problem being resolved is that first the building of confidence, and then the balanced reduction, not for a moment contemplating the once and for all sudden pull-out of Turkish troops as part of a settlement, but working towards a lower and lower levels of troops on both sides as confidence and good relations are restored.
I was just asked if I would say a little on that. Again, like John, I'm in a position of an observer of things Turkish. I won't repeat what he said. I think very often that what comes out when one looks at this sort of dispute is what people don't actually say in public. I mean, I'm subject to lots of Turkish view on the situation. And I noticed that they will talk a great deal, as John mentioned this morning, about constitutional arrangements and so on. They don't talk much about the thing they really fear, which are the three freedoms. Which the three freedoms are very much the Greek Cypriot interest, and they're not the Turkish interest, mainly because they're so dangerous. And you hardly ever see mentioned anywhere in the Turkish press the notion that 100 and something thousand refugees moved to the south, and they have some sort of interest in going back, an emotional interest in going back to the north. That is hardly ever mentioned. Why? Because it is so dangerous. This is, they recognise, as the most dangerous element in it. And this is where the negotiators talk across one another. You know the Greek Cypriots are interested in this, and the Turkish Cypriots are interested in recognition and a constitutional arrangement. So there's a dislocation here. And I won't say any more than that, but other things I want to say, because there are so many people in the audience who want to have a word. Now, it's going to be very difficult for me. I'm going to move from left to right, if I may, and start with the lady.
Yes, I would like to address a question to Dr. Morton. You draw the example of Israel to refute the argument that Turkish Cypriots and the clash are puppets of Ankara. Can you tell us the similarities of Israel and Turkish Cypriots to back your argument? And can you see any difference in terms of character and ethos between the Israelis and Turkish Cypriots?
I wouldn't want to push that too far. I just threw that out really as an example of the fact, really to highlight the fact that Denktash is not a mere puppet of Ankara. I think it's probably more profitable to pursue that one over coffee, but rather than
that's coffee time. I'm moving from left to right. Yes.
The difference between you, Dr. Norton, and the Xenon over what it is difference. Couldn't the problem be solved by having Greek and Turkish troops really confront the problem, really in that garrison, if you like, by actually integrating the command structure, finding some way of integrating the command structure? Now, that really would be an issue, but perhaps a useful one.
I think could you hear that, Bryant?
I will take a number of comments, because otherwise you're going to answer all the time.
I was asked whether there was much possibility of integrating the Greek and Turkish commands in Cyprus in order to try to overcome some of this military problem. But I think it sounds very fine, and it would be perhaps a laudable goal to work towards, but when we've heard of the practical difficulties that arise within NATO at the moment, of the Aegean Command and so on, I think possibly it's rather unrealistic at the moment.
I'm going to ask people to express their questions and ask the speakers to reply and finish. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll get lunch. Very brief question, please.
Very brief question to Dr. Norton, who mentioned that about the adverse economic effects of unification. Do you honestly believe, Dr. Norton, that there will be adverse effects? You know very well that the GDP per capita in 1990 of the Republic of Cyprus citizens was exactly $9,000, and that of the North was $3,000. You know also very well that there are very, very strong trade unions on both sides, and that no Turkish Cypriot citizen would ever accept a penny less from the when working in the South, as it has been proved repeatedly when they came over and worked in Famagusta. Let alone the other vast benefits of unification. Have you seriously examined the effects of this unification before making this statement, or were you just repeating the Turkish view, perhaps? Is it your own conviction, that is, or is it a statement of some of the Turkish some?
Going to leave Norton to think about that. Yes?
I'm sorry that Mr. Price didn't say more about the foreign affairs select committee investigation of the policy over Cyprus in 1974. The Parliament was very adversarial, and I think this is a rare occasion when you had a very bipartisan and reflective look of this foreign policy matter, which was highly critical of the standards of policy. And at some point it would be fascinating to learn more about that.
Moving left to right. Yeah, now, yes. Couple of questions. The first one is with respect to providing security for the Turkish population in Cyprus. Would it not be a solution to have a United Nations command in which the Turkish troops would be part of it and commanded by an international force rather than a separate Turkish command? If it is true that they are peacekeepers, let them be under somebody else's command so that the Greek Cypriots will feel that they have an even hand in the situation. So would that be possible? The second thing is this business of Mr. Dektaş, who you say represents the people of Turkish occupied Cyprus. From my calculations and reading the newspapers, in 1974 there were about 100,000 Turkish Cypriots. And since then, something like 33 or 35,000 have been evicted out of their own homes and being replaced by settlers. So there's only about 60,000 Turkish Cypriots left in Cyprus, 40,000 settlers and 30,000 Turkish troops. Now, who actually elected Mr. Dektaş? And if he was elected by the settlers, would it be not the case that the Muslim population in Bradford would have the same sort of call for power in Bradford as Mr. Dektaş has in his community? Why on earth keep that man in the forefront of Turkish Cypriot politics? Why on earth? He's doing nothing for his own people. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.
Because I'd like to make two comments actually, because I think we've got enough questions to answer.
All right,
anyway.
very brief comments.
Yes, very brief. Well, the first is actually the thing that you identified about going back. I agree with you, it's a problem, although I don't quite see the problem in terms of security in relation to the return of Famagusta. I mean, it would be very easy, in my view, for Greek Cypriots to return to Famagusta immediately without jeopardizing the Turkish Cypriot security difficulties that were identified, unless you can point out.
You mean Varosha or?
Well, I mean in and around. I mean the old city of Famagusta clearly is Turkish Cypriot, and that will remain so. But I don't think the Turkish Cypriots want to return there, and the Greek Cypriots want to return there. I think they want to return. That's quite right. So that doesn't really pose any immediate difficulties that I can see. The second is that I think that actually the question of the Turkish troops or the Greek troops in Cyprus is really a red herring. I don't really think myself that it's a problem. They will stay there until the two communities feel as though they can trust each other. In due course, I imagine both Greece and Turkey will want to have them out because they're costing too much. So really, I don't really think that, apart from the fact that it's offensive to have foreign troops in one's country, on the other hand, there are English troops there and we don't seem to mind them very much, really, despite what Mr. Price is saying. They provided employment at some point, I think. So really, the Turkish argument is not a difficulty. And what I don't understand about the Turks, and I agree with a lot of what you say, what I don't understand about the Turks is why don't they make a move to gain some kind of confidence? I mean, they are in a foreign country. They can give Famagusta back quite easily without really jeopardizing anything that I can identify. And Mr. Norton, could you please tell us why they don't? I mean, is it just the bartering? I mean, is it really something to barter with? After all, it wasn't in their original plan anyway.
All right, thank you. But there is a question after all.
Well...
Yeah. Yes, it must be our last question. Right.
I've got two questions. The one has been put to me earlier on. I'll rephrase it. Because it's to Mr. Norton, he said that in 1974, the invasion of Turkey to Cyprus was to secure the stability and the peacefulness for the Turkish Cypriot community. I'm under the impression and understanding that when someone feels secure in his own place, he doesn't leave. And Mr. Dektaş and the Turkish Cypriot leadership, since 1960 until 1974, they were accusing the Greek Cypriot community and leadership that he was trying to drive the Turkish Cypriots out of Cyprus. But apparently, it appears in the Turkish Cypriot press, and it has been tabled by Mr. Hadjigeorgiou in their side, that between 1960 and 1974, when the Greek Cypriot leadership was trying to force out of Cyprus the Turkish, legally with economical sanctions, the people which they left Cyprus, Turkish Cypriots, they gathered, if I'm right, about 5,000. And between 1974 until a couple of years ago, it was about 35,000 Turkish Cypriots lived out that paradise which the Turkish army brought in the northern Cyprus. That's the one question, and I would like to justify that, irrespective of the numbers which they give about the settlers, which is 80,000 and 40,000 the Turkish army. It's 120,000. Straight away is out of the Turkish Cypriot community as a whole in 1974. How is the person who is selected is not a puppet, and is a democratic elected, as you said earlier on. The other thing I hear from you, what you said earlier on, that always you put Greece and Greek Cypriots. We've got in 1974 a country, an independent sovereign country, being invaded by another country, Turkey. What is the sovereignty of Cyprus democracy? Democracy of Cyprus. What is the Cyprus identity, and then how the Turkish people view and review their stance towards Cyprus as an independent country, member of the UN, and not connected that the Cyprus problem is a problem which can be solved between Mr. Rozar and Mr. Mitsotakis today, or Mr. Papandreou yesterday, or whoever will be the Greek Prime Minister in the future, and not speak with the Cypriot government. And Mr. Rozar refused to accept to see Mr. Vassiliou, in respect of a couple of times invite him to have a talk about the Cyprus problem, because a country has invaded another country.
Thank you very much. Well, looking at the time, I'm terribly sorry to say, but I have to look at the time, part of my mandate. I wonder if we can go, since the questions come on this side of the table more than on this side, if we can go from right to left and make very brief replies. Succinct.
Very briefly, we're looking at the present rather than the past, so there's limited interest in what the Select Committee said, but for what it's worth, it said, and I believe it was right, that the British troops could have prevented the Samson coup and deliberately decided not to do so, and confined themselves simply to rescuing Makarios and later the British tourists, and probably preventing the Turks from taking Nicosia Airport. Those three things. And
the Canadians did that.
They could have done more.
The Canadians prevented the takeover of
British subjects. There's a different account.
It wasn't the British.
Just the second point. I agree that today the British troops are no political problem at all. They're a new form of military tourism which benefits the economy.
I had a whole batch of questions. I think probably I'll answer the easy one. Varosha, or Marash as the Turks call it, the part of Famagusta. I think, to be honest, I think the Turks grossly miscalculated there. They thought this was going to be a good bargaining point, counter that they could use in 1974. They thought that by offering that back they would get a ready solution. They totally miscalculated, and as it is, the bargaining counter has become of less and less value as the quality of the property there has deteriorated and it becomes far less attractive. And of course, as Greek property values have gone up in the south and so on. I did hear on the Turkish side, it was I heard people saying, well, the Greeks aren't all that keen to get it now because their property values have gone up so much in the south. To have a massive injection, not that it would be all that massive, but...
so what's the rationale behind retaining? What's the rationale?
Well, it's still, I think, kept in the hope that it would be a useful bargaining counter. But as I say, I think its value has diminished enormously. That, I think, is a miscalculation in the first place.
Is it accepted that it doesn't cause them a security difficulty, which is the
problem? Oh yes, I don't think for a moment they would.
They should really return.
Yes, and I think
why don't they give it? Why don't they do it as a sign of good gesture? I mean, if they are actually, as you say, and I believe you're true, that they actually are in a situation where they have to lose, they cannot win, they have to lose. So why don't they give the first step of making Varosha return to its proper owners? It's a theft. I mean, that is straightforward theft. Return stolen property, like Mr. Nadir has been forced to do the same. even though he's got a lot of friends in parliament who will soon find themselves in the courts themselves, why don't give Famagusta back to its owners? That would be the first step. As he says, nobody fears the Turkish troops that can come across the other side if they're brave enough, but nobody fears them. Nobody fears them if they stay under Turkish command or under NHS, under United Nations command. So why don't they give the Varosha back?
I think they see this as one of the areas that will be given in the process of any border adjustments that will take place in any agreement. And so they probably don't want to play their hand too soon on this one, but I quite agree with that. I find it very hard to think that there's much point in holding on to that when, as you say, it could well help to provide a goodwill gesture to start things moving. I mean, I can't. So I think something. Yes.
I think it's major reason is the public opinion. As soon as there's a talk about giving a piece of land, again, the opposition political parties start just against the leadership.
Could you continue over coffee, because we've got to get it. No one can hear it. John, any more answers? That's enough answers.
Yes, 2 points only. On this question of Famagusta, really, I agree with Mr. Norton. Well, I don't agree that it's a good will. They come in there as a parking object, no doubt. If they wanted to create a goodwill atmosphere, no doubt they would do it by now. And the second thing is about Dektash. All this talk about comparing Dektash with the situation there with the Israeli, United States situation, no doubt, I don't think it's correct. In fact, now, Mr. Norton, as many of us have noticed, Ankara has already avoided Dektash. They are coming into direct talks with the United Nations. And of course, Dektash himself doesn't like it, but I don't think he can do much.
But he's not controlled entirely by Ankara.
That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying now. Yes, I know your argument. What I'm saying now is that he's completely controlled by Ankara. Ankara is in a position, that's what they are doing now. They are coming to direct talks with the United Nations, although Mr. Dektash doesn't like it. And whether this is a good sign to the extent that we create better conditions for a solution, of course, no one knows. Let us hope that it will.
Well, thank you very much. May I take chairman's privilege and just comment on one point that came up earlier in the economics discussion. And whilst I was listening to that, I'm just sort of contributing what I hear from intelligentsia in Northern Cyprus. On the economic side, one should be a little careful, I think, about worrying too much. I know John mentioned this, about the size of the Turkish contribution. They contribute to the budget to about up to a quarter. It's difficult to disentangle things. But Turkey has, got a very high growth rate. It's a thriving country commercially and industrially, and there are only 160,000 people in Northern Cyprus. And I hear people in Northern Cyprus say, well, why should we bother with the south? I mean, Turkey's going to get richer. They're giving all this provision, and there's extra aid which is accounted for in Ankara, doesn't come through the budget. And there's a great feeling of support for Northern Cyprus in Turkey. And economists there are beginning to say, do we really need to bother with the south? Can't we do better attaching ourselves to a very powerful economy like Turkey, which will do us more good? So, there is that other possibility which seems to be going through people's minds there. Now, this would be very, very unfortunate indeed for a Cyprus solution of the Cyprus problem. But the longer it goes on, although the economy is depressed, I mean, it is growing, after all, by 4 to 5%. The local economists in Northern Cyprus give a higher figure than the figure given in the official statistics, as they might well be inclined to do. But they get 250,000 tourists a year. 75% of those tourists are actually from Turkey. It's important to remember this. And they're doing quite well out of that. And the general sort of feeling is, when you're in Northern Cyprus, the economy is going more than you think. It's very difficult to get building done of any sort. The building industry, it's your first sign of economic development, always gets involved.
The builders go south.
Sorry?
Apparently the builders go south.
Well, no, they don't. There's a great difficulty about getting buildings put up there. So it's as well not to be too sanguine, looking at it from the south side. So bearing in mind the possibilities the longer it goes on. of their joining themselves up more closely to a very large and developing economy. And that is, I think, the danger from the point of view on the economic side of a purely Cyprus.
But but really the reason why nobody believes that the Turkish troops are peacekeeping force. I mean,
well, that's another matter.
Well, that's right.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll be hungry, of course. There is a refectory and there is a graduate common room. I don't think yes, and the kebab house, yes. I don't think that any of the two places can take us all in.
No.
So those who are under 25, please go to the refectory. The rest could perhaps follow me to the graduate common room, and we will be here at about 2 o'clock or 2:15. I mean, don't get dyslexia,
Lastly, it's a great pleasure to introduce your two speakers for the first afternoon session, Dr. Peter Luisas and Dr. Nyazi Zilirik, who both in themselves represent an extraordinary parallel with their topic, the politics of separation and the complications of nationality in Cyprus, in that they both come from villages in the wrong part of Cyprus. One whose village ought to be in the north is in the south, and vice versa. It's always a good out for an academic who's stuck for something to say unusual about topics is whatever the point is made are, but it's different in the style. And it seems to be particularly appropriate for some of us. Yes? Give the floor then to your first speaker, Dr. Peter Luisas.
Thank you. And the further add to the special relationship between Yasin and myself, these Turkish Cypriot co-villagers from Potamya were resettled in Algaki, which is my father's village. Why have the two, I've been asked by someone to speak to why have the Turkish Cypriots lived apart for so long and can they live together as a state? So first, why apart for so long? My framework will be a kind of political sociology. I'm seeking a framework for understanding what happened. There's a simple answer, which says in 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus, the Geneva talks failed, and the geopolitics of the region meant that the Greek Cypriots could find no effective assistance in their hour of need. I hope that answer wouldn't satisfy many people here. I would give it a third in an exam. There are longer answers with longer time depths, but wherever I were to start, someone would object to that entry into history. So I want to outline 6 factors which explain what I see as a long-term trend towards greater separation of the two communities. I would be delighted to be wrong about future predictions. The 6 factors are: first, a weak power-sharing tradition; secondly, increasing involvement with the nationalisms of the motherland; thirdly, reciprocal involvement of motherland political parties in Cyprus; fourthly, practical effects of British colonial policies; fifth, collective failures to control the wild men of the two communities; and sixth, since 1960 particularly, and since 74, rather incompatible goals. In a nutshell, on the last point, Turkish Cypriots have wanted collective security in a weakly federal state. Greek Cypriots have wanted something more like majority rule in a more strongly central state. The Greek Cypriots have had to move towards the Turkish Cypriots on this matter, and they still have further movement to make, in my view, if they are to satisfy the Turkish Cypriots. Now, factor 1, little experience of power sharing. This is a euphemism for talking about the ups and downs of communal relations in the island in the last 150 years. The paradox of our mutual involvements, antagonisms, and collective obsessions. Now, most Greek Cypriots and most Turkish Cypriots have lived for hundreds of years in the island without either killing each other, attacking each other, or apparently being terribly frustrated by the presence of the other ethnic community. That, I take it, is true, and it is not trivial, but it is insufficient to give a comprehensive account of intercommunal relations. Intercommunal incidents of either murderous violence or very high tension took place in Cyprus in 1822, 1833, 1856, 1860, 1904, 1912, just to mention the high-profile incidents. You'll remember that in the Legislative Assembly from 1882 through until 1931, it was rather common to find the Greek members and the Turkish members on opposite sides. I'll talk about the role of the British in that. There were, of course, times when they found common cause. After 1931, the British ruled in such an authoritarian way as to suppress political expression. So we don't find incidents of intercommunal violence until the challenge by AOCA in 1955. And the events after that are familiar to everyone here. My second pull apart factor tending towards separation, is involvement with the motherland nationalism. The expression by Greek Cypriots of the desire for union with Greece grew during the 19th century, intensified in the 20th century. It did not concern itself with the future or the wishes of the Turkish Cypriots. Its logic was a totalizing one. Cyprus was held to be a Greek island, and its future lay within the Greek state. The Turkish Cypriots were perceived as a minority, and they would have to put up with the future wishes of the majority or leave. Turkish Cypriot identification with the Ottoman state was expressed from the first day of the British arrival in 1878, as we heard this morning, and it continued to be expressed as an explicit counter to the Enosis demand all the way down to independence, except that it became transformed on the way into a demand for communal separation, Takis. Now, on the blackboard over there is some material, left-hand blackboard, collected by Richard Patrick, former Canadian UN peace officer in Cyprus, who did an analysis of intercommunal relations. What the figures represent is the number of mixed Greek-Turkish communities in Cyprus at different points in time. You'll see a big drop from 1891 to 1931. It's down nearly 100 villages. From 1931 to 1960, it halves, and from 1960 to 1970, for reasons we're all familiar with, it halves again. Now, I take the trend expressed in those figures to be a kind of barometer which says the more the two communities were involved in motherland nationalisms, the more they tended on the ground to pull apart at the local level in Cyprus. Now, there are other explanations possible. Michael Attalidis thinks that you could explain those tendencies by different rates of migration to towns by Greek and Turkish Cypriots. I'm not convinced, and he hasn't published his analysis, so for the moment, I interpret those figures in the way I've just done. Pull apart factor 3, British colonial rule. I'll be brief. Manipulation in the Legislative Council. Here is what one British official said in 1929, quote, "The system is also bad because it relies upon its efficiency, upon keeping alive the racial hostilities between the two sections of the population. A sounder policy would have attempted to minimize the difference between the Christians and Muslims rather than exploit them." That's quoted by Giorgio Kalidis in his 1954 novel. A second factor of British colonial rule, which aggravated intercommunal relations, was the use of Turkish Cypriot auxiliaries to counter AOCA in the 1955-59 period. Third factor was Eden's strong signals to Turkey to take a more direct role in opposing Enosis. Fourth pull-apart factor, motherland opportunism. I'll just give two examples. The Zorlu Menderes response to Eden was to instigate communal riots against the Greeks in Turkey. Remember, when you remind yourself of that fact, that in 1971 these two gentlemen were disgraced and tried for unconstitutional behavior in Turkey and hung. So Turkish civil society, on reflection, took the matter of those riots very seriously, among other things. Greek example. The Greek colonels, 67 to 74, were prepared to seek a solution to the Cyprus problem over the heads of the Cypriots directly with Turkey. When that failed, they intervened by military coup in Greek Cypriot politics, thus triggering Turkish invasion or intervention, take your pick. Mainland Greece nominee for the president of Cyprus, who else but Nikos Sampson, famous among other things for his attacks on Turkish Cypriots in Nicosia. Pull apart factor 5, failure to control the wild men, just mentioned in a way by the name of Sampson. Now here we have to take a view. There's no contradiction in writing of intercommunal tensions and then saying most of the Cypriots most of the time have lived at peace with the other community, had friends, done business, attended weddings, even fallen in love. But the Cyprus problem has not been produced by what most of the people did most of the time. It has been produced by the uncontrolled activities of small numbers of true believers, passionate nationalists in both communities, prepared to take up arms to pursue visions of a better future for their ethnic communities. Now, because most of the people most of the time are not very political or very brave, those passionate armed minorities have usually silenced the moderates on both sides and blocked attempts at accommodation between the two communities, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. Niaze, I know, will have something to say about silence. An anecdote. Michael Atalidis finished up a diplomatic meeting with some Turkish Cypriots in a state of intercommunal euphoria, and he said, I don't see why we couldn't solve the Cyprus problem between us, because we find it really easy to understand each other and communicate. The Turkish Cypriots replied, I'll say it first in Greek, Καλά Μικάλη, πώς είσαι λογικός, περνούμε καλά μαζί σου εσένα, μα πού ήσουν όταν οι Άγγλοι δικοί σου ήταν να μας φάξουν. All right, Michael, you're a logical person and we can get on well with you, but where were you when the wild men of your community came to try and slaughter us? No, I thought you were playing yourself.
No, I'm just telling the page.
You were going to tell me to go slower or faster.
No, you did very well.
Now, in a nutshell, that is the chief problem of Cyprus up to 74, as I see it. Turkish Cypriots were waiting and perhaps hoping, the moderates among them, for the Greek Cypriots to restrain their wild men, and they did not succeed in doing so. Indeed, the wild men overthrew an elected government, and after 1974, to my great regret, I have to report that they have been allowed to go largely unpunished. I've suggested in writing to President Makarios and verbally to President Vassiliou that even a few exemplary punishments of people for the murder of their Turkish Cypriot fellow citizens in 1974 would have been a very effective way of convincing the Turkish Cypriots that the Greek Cypriots had experienced a change of heart. I regret to say that course of action was considered unrealistic. I'm not in a position to judge the wisdom of their judgments. Pull apart factor number 6, incompatible goals. It seems to me the Turkish Cypriots have always been very clear that their primary goal was security against violence from Greek Cypriot wild men. They said it, they felt it, and they meant it. They were behaving perfectly reasonably to seek that security, and we can see exactly what they meant when we consider the position of the Greek minority in Istanbul and how it has shrunk demographically because of harassment and pressure. Nevertheless, in a document produced by the Greek Cypriot National Council 2 years ago, I noticed that 18 lines are devoted to the Greek Cypriot need for security and 4.5 lines to Turkish Cypriot needs. And these are not even needs for security, they are alleged needs for security. So even in the midst of apparently seeking reconciliation and a settlement, we appear to wish to deny them symbolically the legitimacy of their own collective desires. Now, since 1974, the Turkish Cypriots have had time to reflect on whether political security is enough, and there is evidence that they decide they have secondary goals, including wishing for an increase in economic dynamism and wishing for an improvement in collective political relations with the South. It cannot be very relaxing in the North to be conscious of a hostile and embittered population in the South. Greek Cypriot goals, which I hold to be somewhat incompatible with the ones I've just mentioned. First, not a stated goal, but implicit in everything the Greek political leadership does, is the desire for ethnic unity. It's notable that Makarios, Kyprianou and Vassiliou have treated the preservation of national unity across the political spectrum as a primary tactic for managing their relations with the North. And look where this started. It starts with Makarios offering an olive branch to the people who just tried to kill him. I mean, a more rational response would have been to lock them up. Now, such a tactic becomes a whole way of life. And in my view, it's a way of life hostile to a settlement because it implies both a fear of disunity, and it implies that the Greeks are more interested in unity among themselves than they are in a settlement. Because for there to be a settlement between Greeks and Turks in Cyprus, there have to be losers in both ethnic communities. There have to be some disgruntled people, they have to be compensated and treated with dignity, but their actual preferences may have to be set aside. We never say that. We never say that in the South. The other two Greek goals are protection from Turkey, which geopolitically is completely understandable, but geopolitically Turkey will always be exactly where she is today, 40 miles away, and it makes more sense to think of Turkey as having a common border with Cyprus. There is no guarantee against future Turkish intervention in the Cyprus problem, except the practical protection offered by good intercommunal relations with Turkish Cypriots. It's the only guarantee. Nothing will ever remove Turkey from the lives of the Cypriots. No formula will guarantee could ever do that. The third factor is majority rule, the desire for a strong central state. I was a little worried to hear Mr. Christofides this morning making such a strong emphasis on the German model. The word central was used in preference to federal. I don't know why. Unitary was emphasized. The strength of the state was emphasized. I think there are other federal models we should be looking at. The Swiss model, the Canadian model. The point, as I'm running out of time, the point about these two models is the federal units are conceived of as contracting into the system and retaining the right to contract out if their dissatisfaction with the way the federation works is sufficiently great. Now, Vassiliou, in a speech in London 2 years ago, specifically said he could not object, he could not accept a Turkish Cypriot opt-out right. For my part, I can't see how any Turkish Cypriot leadership, Denktash or anybody else, would ever sign themselves into a new federation which didn't allow them the right to opt out in the event of complete satisfaction. The opt-out clause has never been employed in Switzerland. It may one day be employed in Canada, but it's a very slow business. It requires many procedures. You don't wake up and do it on Monday morning. It will take several years of referenda and accommodation. But that seems to me the ultimate guarantee that weak federalism requires. The other thing before I finish is, in preference to the German model and the Swiss model, when we think about Switzerland as a federal state, we know it contains three ethnic groups who have quite sharply antagonistic perceptions of each other. And they're surrounded by three national states with which they could have sought ethnic alliances or incorporation, forms of enosis into those states, but they haven't done so. They make a federation work by, in some sort of sense, ignoring the states outside them. Now, is this because of some Swiss genius for compromise? If so, it's a genius acquired very recently. The history of Switzerland is a history of minor civil wars between the constituent elements, which are now the cantons. These were sometimes wars between Catholics and Protestants. They were sometimes for other kinds of reasons. But a way of living finally emerged, and it emerged out of a dissatisfaction with continued conflict. Swiss neutrality today is entirely pragmatic. We consider that France has fought Germany twice in this century. The Swiss French and the Swiss Germans would have had to be insane to take up positions within the Swiss Federation in that war. So, free movement between cantons is, of course, federal law for all Swiss citizens, but the cantonal police may not pursue criminals from one canton to another. Most significantly, it is not easy to acquire rights in any Swiss canton unless you were born there or are already a property owner. So to conclude, we have a lot to learn from Switzerland, in my view. If we can learn, we could agree on a future settlement. The settlement will have to involve Greek Cypriots making yet more painful further steps towards the Turkish Cypriot request for rather full local autonomy in a very weak federal system.
Some words on the method of looking back into history. A critical approach towards the past often includes the risk of getting into the trap of might have been for those true. I agree with Carr that only the future can provide the key to the interpretation of the past, and it is only in this sense that we can speak of an ultimate objectivity in history. The criterion of judgment in history is not some principle claiming universal validity, but that which works best in favor of some systematic method or principle claiming universal validity. Before I take up in favor of coexistence in Cyprus, I want to introduce some ideas on the rule which works best. Let's start with the notion of philosophical enlightenment. There is something common to all men which is more important than any differences. It might be said that all men are born equal, that may have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or alternatively, that men are under the two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, and the best social arrangements are those which maximize pleasure and minimize pain. In the case of Cyprus, a better social political arrangement is one that provides a possible rule for bringing the interest of different communities into relation with one another, namely that we sum the total interest satisfaction over all the people concerned and adopt the criterion that one arrangement is better than another if it produces a larger total. Looking into the politics of separatism in Cyprus, from this point of view, without considering the given historical conditions, one could easily say that the Cypriot elite were working not on greater interest satisfaction, but rather on the opposite. Again, bearing in mind the warning of Carr that nothing is more radically false than to set up some supposed abstract standard of the desirable and condemn the past in the light of it, I will try to look into the history of separatism and the journey of the Cypriot elites in the historical circumstances. So first, some thoughts about the Greek nationalism in Cyprus. Greek nationalism had found in 19th century Cyprus the adequate circumstances for its development. The emergence and growth of Greek nationalism in Cyprus was the outcome of the interplay of different factors. Two important factors, as they are emphasized by Kitromelides: the Hellenic ethnological character of Cypriot society, as reflected in its language, traditions, and archaic culture, which provided the demographic and cultural substratum for the implementation of and growth of nationalism. The 19th century process of Greek intellectual expansion emanating from the Hellenic kingdom to the eastern periphery of Hellenism, a policy aimed at the ideological preparation of the application of the political program of the great ideal. It was this ideological process that politicized the local ethnological traditions and turned them into dynamic elements of political change. Another important factor was the clash between the Orthodox Church and colonial government. You couldn't digest the church as a political leader of the Greek Cypriot community and try to undermine it. This was the paradox of the colonial regime, because under the British communal approach to governance, namely divide and rule, the Orthodox Church primates confirmed themselves as the political leaders and representatives of the Greek Cypriots. Another factor, which was encouraging the Greek nationalism in Cyprus, was heavily exploited peasants who were financially dependent on the Greek Cypriot elite, which in turn was the carrier of Greek nationalism. The growth of movement of national consciousness raising and national assertion that culminated in a political vision of national emancipation through union with Greece turned the archaic, distant Greek-speaking community of Cyprus into a dynamic political society which excluded as heresy and treason the visualization of any other form of collective existence short of union with Greece, while undermining the independent republic that was created in 1960. The expansion of Greek nationalism in Cyprus resulted in an oversight, even the oblivion of Turkish Cypriot community. then the Greek Cypriot ruling elite was made aware of Turkish Cypriots by Britain and Turkey during the Assoc movement, and was forced to share power with the Turkish Cypriot community by Greece, Turkey, Britain, and the USA. This was only half-hearted accepted. Before I go any further, I want to mention that the British colonial government was one of the major contributors to the politics of Cypriots, with the preservation of the politicization of traditional corporate structures and cultures. The British colonial policy laid the infrastructure of future ethnic confrontation and conflict. So a quote was made before by Peter Blazos, which I don't want to repeat it here because I don't have the same quote. But I want to quote another colonial office document. It says, "The simplest value seemed to be the way of divide and rule. Communal representation was invented. If we had been at Nicosia, safe official majority, if we had not had play of Turk against Greek, if we had not had to restore the estrangement of secular progress, the administration would have laid better foundations and taken more pride in its job." This is a critical approach by colonial office administrator. Now, I will leave out this colonial praxis because it's well known and Peter mentioned also, so I'm going now into emergence and growth of Turkish nationalism in Cyprus. Nationalism arrived in the Turkish-speaking community of Cyprus almost 1 century later than the Greek nationalism. Until the Kemalist revolution and emergence of modern Turkey, the Turkish-speaking community of Cyprus was ruled by the Ottoman elite, which became a part of British colonial administration. In the 1920s, under the influence of Kemalism, some Turkish civil intellectuals organized themselves and started to challenge the Ottoman elite and their supporters, the British colonial government. With the support of First Turkish Council of Turkey in Cyprus, Assoc, a nationalist group of Turkish Cypriot intellectuals managed to organize the First National Congress in Cyprus in 1931. Their main claim was to introduce the introduction of Kemalist reforms in Cyprus, democratization of the Turkish Cypriot community, which was under one-man rule, named under the rule of the religious leader Sir Münir. It is enlightened to quote the colonial officer's view of Sir Münir. Münir Bey is the leader of the Turkish population of this colony. He is 100% pro-British, has the mentality of old Turkish Pasha, and has absorbed into himself every office he could. The function of the traditional elite was to secure support of the British government against the political demands of the Greek Cypriot elite and to keep the Turkish Cypriot community apart from Kemalism. It is important to mention that Kemal's anti-British foreign policy in the 20s was also reflected by the Turkish Cypriot nationalists. The national consciousness raising among the Turkish Cypriots in this period was an attempt for democratization of the community. This had an anti-British character and was not against the cooperation with Greek Cypriots. When the active member of Turkish nationalism in Cyprus, Necati Bey, was elected to the Legislative Council in 1930, he cooperated with the Greek Cypriot members of the council and voted together. A drastic change came up after the Greek Cypriot uprising took place in 1931 and resulted in abolishing the Legislative Council. The Turkish Cypriot nationalists began to seen as a refuge by the British colonial government, and the change pattern of Kemalist foreign policy in the 30s, namely to ally themselves with Britain against a potential Italian danger in the Mediterranean, which was encouraging the nationalist Turkish Cypriots to friendly policy towards colonial government. Towards the end of the 1930s, the colonial government was prepared to adapt itself to the new conditions of Turkish Cypriot community and to harmonize its relations with the Turkish Cypriot nationalists. On 19th November 1937, Downing Street sent a new policy to the colonial government in Cyprus. I'm quoting. "It is important to make the Muslims of Cyprus feel that the government is taking adequate care of their interests and that they have a defined part to play in the colony under British administration. The collapse of the old order, Turkey, and the rise of Kemalist Republic has created a new problem to which the British administration in Cyprus must seek to adapt itself. It seems desirable that government should endeavour to make an appeal to the younger and more progressive Cypriot Turks." After the Second World War, started the second chapter of Turkish nationalism in Cyprus. In other words, Turkish Cypriots nationalists start to move from Turkish nationalism in Cyprus towards the Turkish Cypriot nationalism. Due to the fact that Enosis became the national claim of every Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriots attempted to organize their first mass organization. In 1937, Katak, the Association of Turkish Minority in Cyprus, was formed and developed close relations with Turkey. This reaction against the Enosis movement was also encouraged by the colonial government. In April 1948, a special Turkish committee was set up by colonial governor Lord Winster. The special Turkish committee improved the relations between Turkey and Turkish Cypriots. First group of Turkish teachers arrived in Nicosia along with school material. Reforms like Kemal's were introduced in Cyprus. The educational and political mobilization to raise the Turkish national consciousness activated between 48 and 58 resulted in recognition of Turkey as the fatherland of Turkish Cypriots, which from now on will work hand in hand with the Turkish Cypriot elite to stop Enosis. In this period, mass demonstrations against Enosis, diplomatic negotiations between the leadership of Turkish Cypriots and Turkey, the emergence of TMT as a military measure, and recruitment of Turkish Cypriot police force against Assoc fighters followed. As a colonial officer in 1948 understood, the clash seemed inevitable, and the colonial government was heavily responsible for it. To quote directly, I am very concerned at the apparent growth of minority consciousness among the Turks in Cyprus during the last year, and I fear that the Cyprus government may have unwittingly encouraged this by, for example, the Committee for Turkish Affairs, which Lord Winster has set up. The superficial attractions of a loyal minority community supporting the government of a foreign protective power ought to be too well known by now for us to fall into this kind of trap. Recent history is literate examples from Northern Ireland to the Muslims in India. The only way out is for minority community to make its peace with the majority without seeking protection elsewhere. Towards the end of the 1950s, both communities were politically separated. Their national claims, Enosis and Taksims, were beyond compromise. However, they had one thing in common: the dominant ideological orthodoxy. Both ruling elites were ruthless in discrediting as national betrayals all voices of heretical criticism. They did not limit themselves to moral and psychological coercion, but went all the way in using their gangs to achieve physical liquidation of dissenting critics. With the words of Petromerides, out of configuration of two opposed conservative and authoritarian nationalisms, symbolically antagonistic and mutually exclusive, developed the dialectic of intolerance that provided the ideological content of ethnic conflict. Precisely on the eve of her independence, Cyprus experienced the crystallization of this dialectic of intolerance that stretched from the ideological to most other levels of public life. When the compromise in 1960 took place and the Republic of Cyprus emerged, both antagonists were forced into sharing sovereignty and state power. However, due to their national claims and ideological equipment, this has been not possible. The Greek Cypriot ruling elite was quick to develop a policy to reduce its Turkish Cypriot partner to minority status. The Turkish Cypriot ruling elite, in turn, was encouraging hostility out of ethnic differences in order to defend its status as equal partner. In other words, equality was based on hostility. If a political community is viewed as a group of people living together under a common regime, with a common set of authorities to make important decisions for the group as a whole, one could argue that the authorities within the new birth state were not after the equal consideration of both communities, they were instead after separate politics and controversial national aims. Besides the oppressive character of national ideologies, the charismatic leader of both communities, like Makaris and Denktash, who were seen as possessing extraordinary qualities of understanding and as really defending the needs of the ruled, disabled the opposition in Cyprus to come out and challenge the adventures of ruling elites. Although Cyprus had the opportunity to overcome the national antagonism between 1960 and 1974, with foreign interventions on the one hand and the dogma of national claims of elites on the other hand, made the events of July 1974 inevitable. So far I tried to explain why the Cypriots are living separated. Our next topic is if they can live together in a single state. Taking ideological habits of both communities today, one could argue that what we had in the past is going to repeat itself since the narrow nationalist agendas determine the political life of both communities. I do not agree with this assumption. Because there is not anymore any national war to fight in Cyprus.
The total war has been made in 1974, and the nationalist attempts have failed. With other words, nationalism in Cyprus has had its attemptions and failed to succeed. Both national aims, Enosis and Taksim, which grown historically, didn't get with our history. Not only the Cypriots, but the whole world knows that Enosis and Taksim are not and cannot be the future pacifists. This is where my optimism lies. The new attempt for coexistence is not doomed to failure because of the past experience, as some people are arguing. The opposite is rather true. The past is encouraging the new attempts for coexistence since it represents the failure of politics of Cyprus. Now Cypriots know what it means, national universal claim. Now we shall know which works best for Cyprus. And we learned there is another very important aspect I want to mention, which I have right here, is that today another optimistic feature of Cypriot politics is that Cypriots, they don't look for a fatherland outside of Cyprus anymore, which I see as an important factor of Cypriot politics today. By saying this, I emphasize the historical and political grounds of coexistence. What remains is that ideological attitude must move towards this reality. Cypriots should find ways to talk to each other, as Zenon Stavridis said in his speech, but to talk with the other includes also the dialogue with self. First, one has to listen his/her own mistakes, but this is only possible if we get out of our national prisons and learn to consider the human interest of all Cypriots equally. Since we don't have any other alternative, this became more true and more necessary, which now needs to turn into will. Thank you very much.
I did not attend the morning session. I was very pleased to hear Dr. Loisiu's suggestion about adopting a similar system to a Swiss one. It's very, very interesting, although I don't think that both cultures, the Greek and the Turkish, which have always been different, and also the religious aspect has to be thought about. But whatever the pattern is, what I'm concerned is, will that nation of the Cyprus, or the two communities can live happily, but will it serve the interests of the Americans? A Cyprus which has always done that. I forget about Europe because we feel now that a Europe will have, a united Europe will really have a more benign attitude towards Greece, I would say, because it's part of the Europe, Greece now, although in the past we felt that we were not really a part of Western Europe. But the American question is very, very important, because we don't have to sacrifice Cypriot again and both countries now, I would say Greece and Turkey, in order to serve the American interests. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention.
I feel that the two Cypriot communities, with Greece and Turkey, are the agents and actors who can produce the settlement. And I don't think it's down to the Americans. I don't actually see why the Americans would be tremendously interested, even though there are two British bases they might take an interest in. I mean, I think America can pursue its foreign policy interests with a divided Cyprus, or a unified Cyprus, or no Cyprus at all, or a Cyprus growing oranges on every square yard. I mean, I just don't think it's relevant. Very relevant. that much.
Dr. Peter, my choice of West Germany was, I'm sure you consider that, I mean, I would be quite happy, and I'm sure Mr. Vassiliou, President Vassiliou would be happy to choose the model of Switzerland that you mentioned. It was purely operational, whether operational it would be more efficient and so on.
But I would like to respond to that. I fear that I was trying to listen to what you were saying as if I were a Turkish Cypriot who had not very good experiences for the last 25 years. And I thought, it sounds as if everything will be done for us by the central government, but it isn't clear to me how much our voice will count in that central government. And that seems to me the fundamental factor, and that is why the insistence on political equality is so important to Turkish Cypriot. So we would have to see what this government looked like, and they have been rather clear on preferring the central government to be relatively weak and the cantonal governments to be relatively strong.
Peter, I agree with the whole of your analysis in the speech that you gave earlier, except for one point, which I think you didn't address, and that is what kind of impact will the analysis that you presented have on the Greek Cypriots? Because it seems to me that they're going to lose on every point. You did actually acknowledge that it's going to be very painful. Yes. But it's going to be, is it possible? I mean, is it really realistic for the Greek Cypriots to accept that for the last, not so many years, they have really messed the whole thing up to the point where they've got to give way on every single important issue? That's what the effective analysis suggests. I mean, do you think it's realistic?
I'm pessimistic about whether that movement will take place. I think that the alternatives, as most of us see them, are worse. I think staying as we are is not very good for us or for them. I think that the potential political instability, possibly affecting Greece and Turkey, you've heard about the Aegean disputes. I mean, if we could get one thing right between Greece and Turkey, maybe the other disputes would be solved. But while we have the Cyprus problem unresolved, as well as the Aegean disputes, the potential for future conflict between Greece and Turkey is very great. And I regard that as something on all counts to be avoided.
But can I press you on it? I mean, do you really think the Greek Cypriots will buy that? I mean, it's all very well to say this is the ideal thing to happen in these circumstances. But I mean, will they buy it? Is there anyone in Cyprus?
If Vassiliou sells it hard enough, if he will break out of the idea that the whole political spectrum must agree on everything before they can move forward, I think he's got to take more risks. He's got to say, I'm going to write off a percentage of potential Greek Cypriot political support in order to reach out to the Turkish Cypriots who don't think Denktash is the answer. There has to, I mean, they've got to take a risk, we've got to take a risk in order to move forward. It's a big risk. It is a leap in the dark. But if we don't make it, the future options seem to be stagnation of the kind.
Of course, Denktash thinks that the no solution option is an option.
We have a series of first here.
Yes, can I just follow on from that really, and start from Dr. Niazi's point that nationalism has actually had its chance in Cyprus and failed in both communities, and therefore the solution will have to be found across a political spectrum that is capable of uniting the two communities. I think that is the basis. Both of you said the same, and I agree that is the basis. It's also the basis upon which nobody else should actually be allowed to have a say. I see no reason why Greece should have a say in my affairs in Cyprus. I don't see why Niazi should have Turkey saying anything about his father's house in Cyprus. Nothing to do with Turkey, nothing to do with Greece. It's entirely up to us to decide what to do in solving the political question. Having said that, the facts of life have developed the way you said it, and the facts of life are that we have got two communities which are disparate in terms of numeral support, 80% versus 18%. Whether you like it or not, that is a fact of life. You cannot cede the rights of the majority entirely to equal the rights of the minority and vice versa, and a solution will have to be based upon the recognition of that fact. There will have to be equality in such a way as both sides are equal, but not one equal one than the other. The third point that has to be considered is that the negotiators at the moment are under the threat, and I use the term, the threat, of Turkish troops. It could be Greek troops, it could be Iraqi troops, for that matter, it could very easily be Syrian troops, because the Syrians have just as many demands on Cyprus as the Turks have. Greater Syria envisages Cyprus as part of its plan, as you probably know. So we cannot actually negotiate properly or take a risk in negotiating properly whilst there is the threat of military action by a very powerful nation. So we're both going to be the losers if we take a risk, because at the end of the day, it has never been the case that the Turkish army, in particular, is something, an agency, that can be trusted. It's not a democratic institution, it's an army that has its own thoughts, its own ideas, its own way of behaving. It will behave the same to the Turk as it does to the Kurd and as it has done to the Greek. So we cannot negotiate while that threat is actually there. We're not talking about the British army, a civilized army, shall we say. We're talking about somebody else.
Thank you for that reference to the civilized British army.
I would say just two things. I mean, it's not helping quite a lot to find a good argument and not to negotiate. And sometimes, for example, Turkish army now, some are saying, okay, so, I mean, we can't negotiate because Turkish army is in Cyprus. I remember exactly what Takis was saying in 1971. There is the Greek, before 67, there is the Greek army, how can we negotiate about the things? And Cyprus is a whole, there are a lot of elements. If you pick up just one factor to make out of it, to disable the negotiation process or the greater rapprochement of communities, I think is not helping very much.
Can I have a quick word? We're talking about a window of opportunity now. Ozal has some popularity. He is also, as I understand it, a civilian leader. We do not have military government in Turkey. That has happened periodically. I would sooner we negotiated with Ozal while the army is under civilian control than wait for another military intervention from the Turkish army when I think it would be much more difficult in some ways to get a settlement, depending on what the character of political rule was. But I think this is a good time for things coming together.
I fully agree with you. It is the right opportunity. But I think there's got to be some counter to the actual military threat.
Thank you. Behind and then
yes. Dr. Niazi said that from 1960 until 1963, when there was existed an inequality because of the constitution that has been given to the Cypriots by the British through the London-Zurich Agreement, and so that inequality, it was so in the face of the guns and the clashes. At the same time, I would like to elaborate more on the role of the British, which they play on the 13 points which Magarus wanted to change on the Constitution, and to comment in regard, because it appeared that before 1960, when the 1963 was the clashes, in the office of Dr. Kuchukis, it had been found documents which they were shown for the Turkish Cypriot to prepare for the uprising against the Greek Cypriots. And you know, it is very well known about the Haiti, which was being taken in Konchin and Masura, bringing guns from Turkey mainland to the Turkey. And the Volcanic KMT, which was based and created by the Dash, it was an active unit in the Turkish Cypriot community at the same time.
So we can see that there is not the inequality between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, but there is a condition before that, that the Turkish Cypriot extreme right wing, they are prepared and they are getting prepared while they were sitting in the same table discussing with the Greek Cypriots to uprise against the Greek Cypriots. Well, actually, I said before in my speech that both leadership were working against the Republic of Cyprus, not only the Turkish Cypriot leadership, but also the Greek Cypriot leadership. And my view is that the Greek Cypriot leadership was working stronger than the Greek Cypriot leadership. And it proves one can easily find in Cleary's books, which is published lately. So not to go around with conspiracy theories that British were trying to destroy. I think nobody was looking for a destruction of Republic of Cyprus between 1960 and 64. There has been no foreign hand in these affairs. What my research teaches me is that both leaderships were really looking for and taxing instead of establishing the Republic of Cyprus. This is the truth.
I want to address two issues raised by the speech by Dr. Peter. The first issue is the issue of the punishment of the white men of the two communities, especially of the Greek Cypriot community. I must say that I strongly share this view, but I think that the Cypriot government, and especially Makarios, has been restrained in doing so. And I would cite some facts, or perhaps they are rumors. You can tell me if I'm wrong. I was only 7 years old when Makarios returned in Cyprus, but what I was told by my parents.
Which time? You returned what?
In December 1974. But there was a strong rumor circulating in Cyprus at that time that Makarios was not allowed to return to Cyprus unless he accepted the conditions imposed to him by the three guarantor powers, and mainly the British. So I believe that Makarios did not have free hands in punishing the coupists and the people who tried to kill him. And I think that this makes much sense if we bear in mind that Makarios' life was saved by the British. Makarios left Cyprus through a helicopter from the British sovereign base area in Akrotiri, if I'm not wrong. This is the first issue, I think. The second one is the issue of the opting out of federal structure. This right should be guaranteed to the Turkish Cypriots.
And to the Greek Cypriots.
And to the Greek Cypriots. Okay. But it doesn't make much sense, at least to me, if we address this issue in isolation to the right, to the implementation of the right of self-determination of the Cypriot people as a whole, and not the implementation of this right separately for the two communities. And I think that this was born clearly in the last resolution by the Security Council of the UN, the 649 resolution, which rejected Dektash's claim that the right of self-determination should be implemented separately for the two communities. In other words, he claimed that there are two peoples living in Cyprus.
Well, I haven't heard about the three guarantor powers putting any limits on Makarios' freedom of action. I think Makarios felt himself to be politically weak, and I think he was divided in his own mind about what he should do. I think, in a certain sense, he remained a Greek nationalist to the end. That's why he found it difficult to punish him. But on the second point, which is more interesting to me, I don't know when the political leaders are playing definitional games and when they're serious. It's very hard for outsiders to tell why these negotiations keep stopping. We keep hearing people say, why doesn't one side make the first move? But why should the other side make the first move? Why shouldn't our side make the first move? So those arguments continue. Surely, as a phenomenological fact, there are two peoples in Cyprus. I mean, there have to be. One of them has succeeded for historical reasons in being recognized as the government of Cyprus. I've always been extremely unhappy about the implications of that. I don't think it has been a policy that I can, as a Greek Cypriot in origin, take any satisfaction in. When you press government representatives on it, they say, look, the only weapon we have against Turkish Cypriots in Turkey is to withhold recognition. If we stop doing that, we've nothing left, and then Takis can do what he likes. And I suppose that is the kind of realistic problem. They can't afford to let Denktash have a one game, but meanwhile, we're not getting anywhere.
Time for just two more questions here, and the last word to you.
I would like to refer to two issues that Dr. Loizos had mentioned. First of all, when he said that we must move closer to the Turks regarding the federal government and allow the introduction of a weak federal government. And second, the fact that the fact to mention that now that Mr. Rosal, who is a civilian, is the time to find a solution. Now, the first point is that are we really saying that any solution, it's a good solution just for the sake of it, even if it involves major and fundamental issues such as freedom of movement, government, which must be a very big issue. And secondly, regarding the statement about Mr. Rosal, I find it difficult to accept that there is no involvement of the Turkish army in Turkey at the moment, and Mr. Rosal is not influenced by their attitude or beliefs, when we see every day suppressions and torture according to the Amnesty International and other organizations, which...
Okay, look, of course the Turkish army is an awesome Turkish army, but the invasion in 1974 was a decision of Ecevit, who was a civilian. So, I mean, you must remember that there's a difference between military rule and civilian rule. I simply think...
But I don't, this is what I'm saying, Dr. I don't see any difference whatsoever now from what it was. And also the fact about finding a solution no matter what it is. Is that what you were saying?
I see it very differently.
I think that the situation there was simply a coincidence of views. And fair enough, Ecevit was a socialist, and he lived to regret it in the hands of the Turkish army afterwards.
He's just published an interview in which he says he has no regrets about...
I'm sure he has, because Margaret Thatcher hasn't got any regret, but she's nowhere to be heard. But nonetheless, that was just a coincidence of views. We have to recognize the fact that Turkey is a nation that at the moment is under the control of a very large and powerful machinery, the army. That's the thing we have to consider all the time.
I think the last thing we have to consider is Zenon's question.
Yes. I'd like to ask a question, a point of fact, really. I want to put a question to Niazim. But the background of my question is this. It's, I think, indisputable that within the Greek Cypriot community, there is a growing number of people who, on realizing that any solution that is being offered, it's on offer, would involve a partnership arrangement with the Turkish Cypriots, prefer the situation to remain what it is. They will vote in elections for Vigo maybe, or a DEC, which takes a hard stand, but in fact they don't expect that it's going to happen. Now, therefore, there is this growing number of cynics, if you like, among the Greek Cypriot community who don't believe that they can attain their objectives of bringing the clock back as far as possible, and they would prefer, rather than get a partnership state, to go for, in effect, a two-state situation. Now, I'd like to know whether there's similar cynicism among Turkish Cypriots, or whether there is a group of people, an influential group of people, who goes for a strong position, not because they believe it's going to happen, namely a loose federation, whatever it is, but because they really don't want a solution other than or different from what exists now, in fact.
Thank you for your questions. First, I want to say, as I tried before, I was trying to describe the historical circumstances on which the new coexistence can be based after the collapse of national adventure in Cyprus. But and at the end of my speech, I said these new conditions, which is grown out of a necessity, must turn into a real and ideological attitude. What I see in Cyprus, and what makes the movement towards, is exactly a gap between the new historical reality and circumstance in Cyprus and the ideological understanding, which we still carrying the legacy of the nationalisms from the or national antagonism of the past. Of course, there are in both communities still people who are thinking in their national ideological model, and this is always antagonistic. And I will say rather, Turkish Cypriot in northern part of Cyprus, rather we say let's keep the situation as it is, or in south they will say, well, I mean, if we don't rule again, so we don't make any unification. But I show in Cyprus also another growing number of people, which actually is helping me to be an optimist in both communities, whereas always a growing number challenging this very narrow nationalist approach to each other. For example, in last elections in South Cyprus, we find two parties like Lysi and Aker, which I know are ready for a kind of compromise. They don't have a discourse of nationalist antagonism, and they have been both the biggest parties in Cyprus. I know some subgroups, intellectual movements in Cyprus also, in south and north. We are challenging, and they are talking about what Peter mentioned before, for example, to come out to say how we killed each other, and when and where, to give me names and dates, which are working on making a documentary, writing stories, which are actually things we are having only after 74 in Cyprus, which are making me very optimistic in Cyprus. But the gap between the historical circumstances and the ideology and way of thinking is still there, and it's not very easy to challenge this. But you don't have any other thing to do rather than trying it, and I think the Cypriots are trying well.
Thank you for that. Thank you both. It's a great sadness to me to have to close this discussion. You'll appreciate, I know, as much as I have, the great contribution that our speakers have made in the most difficult slot of any conference, when everybody most wants to go to sleep. These two distinctly unwired events stimulated great discussion. I'm most grateful to both. Ladies and gentlemen, just one moment. I'm afraid we've allowed the discussion to roll on a little bit, and rather than a 15-minute break, in order to regain some time, I'm afraid this will only be a 5-minute break. Shall we reconvene by that clock at 25?